It is clear that he would not just stand by, so Lee Jun jumped up and immediately rushed to the attack in order to eliminate them as quickly as possible. Joan also decided to keep up and went to help, waving her sword. After the next portion of the opponents was destroyed, the girl stopped and waited for further instructions from Lee Jun. Her look changed a lot, because she really couldn't understand what was going on here. The thing is that this looks really very strange, especially since there are quite a lot of strong monsters here. But Lee Jun understood what she was talking about now, because he himself noticed that it had become much more difficult to control his mana. Joan confirmed this, and also added that the movements and battle tactics of the opponents are very different. They all seem to be human. Lee Jun understood perfectly well that her words made sense. Apparently, the process of being absorbed by the gate was happening much faster than he could have expected, so for now they would move on. Outside, the snow only continued to get heavier and the road became more and more difficult. Joan understood that there was probably a logical explanation for this, but so far nothing had come to mind. She left the guy a little to think, after which she asked how far they would need to advance in this format. But Lee Jun said that they would need at least 2 months of moving on their own 2 legs, if not more. Joan even screamed in fear because she couldn't believe it. Lee Jun turned to her and laughed, because all this is only if they continue moving, which means that they cannot waste so much time standing around in this place. Therefore, now we need to find something that they will ride on, and their starting point will be completely different. He pointed his finger towards the heavenly lake at the top of Pektisan. The trolls continued to lie in the ground and did not bother anyone at all. When the team had already walked a sufficient number of kilometers, they stopped to warm up at least a little, because do not forget that it was bitter winter outside all this time. Lee Jun understood that he didn't want to be here and just waste time, so he looked at the girl and said that let her sit here for now, and he would take a walk and explore the situation. Joan simply silently agreed with him, because she understood perfectly well that moving on when she was so cold was simply a real mockery. After some time, June returned to her, not alone, but with a couple of red deer that he could find. After which their journey became much more comfortable and pleasant, because you will agree that it would be much better to move on reindeer than to walk such a long distance and get your clothes wet with your feet in the snow. It is important to note that it is really very easy to get lost in this forest, so all hope was only that June really knew what he was doing. When even the deer were tired of running, the guys stopped to discuss further plans and take a break. Joan understood that they were now climbing to the top of Pektisan, but shouldn't it get colder as they climbed there? After all, the closer they rise to the top, the hotter they become. Joan also thought about it, because they had never even met monsters on their way here, and this made her very wary. Lee Jun reassured the girl, because the ruler of the mountain really protects her very well, so there's definitely no need to worry. Joan looked at him and asked what this means. What ruler of the mountain? Is this really a man? Jun was a little surprised by such a stupid question, so he said that of course not. How could he be human? But the girl decided to find out who they were going to deal with, so she decided to ask a lot of questions. But Lee Jun interrupted her and said that he himself didn't even know what would be the correct name for them. In any case, it's worth getting ready because the girl will see them herself very soon, so he suggested it was better to leave the animals in this place for now. Now they will need to try to break through the barrier as quickly as possible. After these words, everything began to glow. Indeed, real magic appeared here, which protected the passage from prying eyes and bad intentions. So without some preparation, it is generally unrealistic to see exactly where the traps are. Heimdall was meanwhile on the roof and understood that after the appearance of the gate, the world plunged into real chaos. He awakened forces that surpassed all others on his path, so he set himself the task of finding Asgard and devoting himself entirely to people. But after he began to use his powers for the sake of humanity, he realized that it is only natural that all those who cannot use magical power will be left behind. So only hunters who are able to survive disasters are those people whose protection is now his direct responsibility. Li Jun went to China, but he was more disappointed that the country did not live up to his expectations, because the climatic conditions had indeed changed, and monsters began to rage in every city. He understood perfectly well that a guy who did not have the power of a hero at all, and who managed to defeat Hercules without her help, could still manage to find what he had not been able to do in his time. He laughed and realized that Li Jun was indeed worthy of attention, and the situation was becoming very interesting. Heimdall had not experienced such emotions for a very long time, so he even bit his tongue with joy. After this, of course, there was a corresponding reaction in the form of pain, because you shouldn't be so self-confident and underestimate other people. But his shock was not for this reason at all. Heimdall knew very well that right now he certainly could not absorb it so early. He spread his arms and began to laugh, forming magic near him, because he understood perfectly well that now it would be much more pleasant for him to slowly enjoy it. Because Li Jun really is the best snack with which he can drown out his irresistible hunger. Meanwhile, the guys had already managed to get to the top and were pleasantly surprised, because there was no more snow and it was warm. Joan was happy because he really hates the cold, so Li Jun beat her to it and said that they had finally arrived at the same place. He looked around, and immediately after that, he took out his weapon. This is the same heavenly lake that they have been going to for so long, so now they need to be extremely careful. Opposite Li Jun stood people who were shocked by the appearance of strangers on the territory and were preparing to meet them. Joan also quickly prepared to engage in battle, because she didn't really want to fight right now, especially since they looked like hunters. Li Jun said that in the lands of monsters live people who survived from the ancient lands of North Korea. They were very surprised by this, so they shouted at the guy and asked how he knew so much about them. But Li Jun wanted to resolve everything peacefully, so with a calm voice he said that now he would like to meet with the ruler of the mountain. People were very surprised because information about the king is really hidden all the time, and very few people know about it, so they understood that the guy was very dangerous. Without wasting a minute, the people took out their weapons and prepared for battle, because they understood that now their main task would be to destroy the invaders. Li Jun was shocked because all he wanted to do was avoid an unnecessary fight. But it seems like he really has no other choice. One of the attackers looked to the side and was horrified, because a completely unexpected event had happened. The little girl began waving her hands and saying that the king had given her orders to call the guests for an interview. Due to failed nuclear experiments, their country became a wasteland even before the gate appeared, so after that, a lot of refugees began to look for a new refuge. People stopped their attack because of the girl, but still started screaming and asking again how the guy knew about them. But he just looked at them and said that, now, this is a really difficult question. The girl immediately approached the warrior and began to scold him, asking whether he was really ready to behave like that with the guests of the owner of the mountain. She also warned him, saying that if they knew about the king, of course they would know about them in the same way. The guy was shocked, but still he felt scared, because he understood that the new arrivals could easily be accomplices of their main enemies, because of whom they are now here. He told her that he would go away for a second to discuss the matter with his colleagues. But the girl understood perfectly well that now she needed to take the situation into her own hands, because although they were able to deal with them, now their people are as if on pins and needles. Li Jun approached the little girl and decided to talk to her on his own, since he perfectly understood that she was much higher in status than ordinary warriors. The guy raised his voice a little, saying that he was not as old as she might think. This scared the girl, because she was counting on a completely different outcome of the dialogue. After talking, they immediately went to the market. People were shocked because they had not seen guests in this place for a very long time. And the guy actually invited the girl to look at their clothes, because apparently they really came from the outside world. But they could not believe it, because all this for a time they believed that it was completely destroyed. Lee Jun and her friend looked really amazing, and John informed him that there were about 200 people here, most of them hunters. June also understood perfectly well that these were people who were able to survive in such harsh conditions. There was a guy at the entrance who, seeing the new arrivals, immediately ordered them to move away from this place and did not want to let them in any further. Lee Jun was very surprised when a man with a spear began to stand in front of him, so he only laughed and asked if it was customary for them to receive all guests in this way. Didn't the owner of the mountain tell him to personally bring the new arrivals to him? But the guy was really scared and angry at the same time, because even though he had such an order, he simply refused to take them to the owner. So the little girl quickly intervened in the conversation, trying to defuse the tense situation. The guy didn't even want to listen to her, because the girl should perfectly understand the state the owner is in now. After these words, June lit up, because he began to understand perfectly well that something had happened to the owner of the mountain. But still he turned to the guy and said that his opinion in any case did not matter. After these words, he immediately rushed into battle, since he had just been humiliated, so he decided to take revenge. The girl began to scream and also turn into a monster. It seemed that she was offended by this. Lee Jun understood that the situation now was quite strange. His opponent was also scared because he didn't know what to expect now. In the name of the head of the village of Chengji, she ordered him to immediately get out of the way and clear the way. He accepted this and immediately lowered his head in front of her, following the order. The girl looked at the newcomers, who were almost fighting for the second time, and told them to continue to follow her. Then their road to the owner of the mountain passed through a cave. Lee Jun asked his friend if she knew anything about the Tangun myth, but she didn't even know what it was. So the guy said that there is a long-forgotten folk myth called the Myth of Tangun, about how Hwanung came down from the mountains and discovered Korea, founding our people there. Joan looked at the guy and didn't understand why he decided to remember this right now, when there were no prerequisites for this. Lee Jun decided to say that the locals clearly know something about this. The girl was very happy when she came closer to her owner. At the main entrance, there was a magical blue field and a lot of fire. And now the new arrivals began to be greeted by a huge white tiger, who was smiling and in a good mood. The guy took a few steps, and having approached a sufficient distance, he decided to ask whether the tiger was the real owner of the mountain. Tiger smiled and said that even though they were superior to all of his military forces, the fact that they knew about him made them honorable guests anyway. He stood up and said that he really was the master of Mount Paektusan, so he wanted to know what exactly brought the guys to him. Joan was scared because she couldn't understand what this terrifying aura was. Lee Jun also understood that this was indeed a real mess. The tiger was a little surprised by this statement, but still decided to just continue listening to what they came with. Lee Jun said that the power with which he protects this mountain will disappear very soon. He looked at him carefully and realized that the tiger was dying right now, because the source of his powers, Mount Paektusan, was gradually beginning to collapse. The tiger was scared by such a statement, so he wanted to immediately find out who Lee Jun really was. He stood in front of him and said that he was indeed the one who could help the tiger, but Lee Jun added that he would like to meet, but not with him. After that, he paused and said that he would still like to communicate with the true owner of the mountain. The tiger began to scream and fell into a rage because he could not even imagine that the newcomers could be so impudent. Li Jun also started screaming because he knew very well that they were able to detain the intruder. But it is not at all normal for the owner of the mountain to be a dying idiot, so he ordered the tiger to immediately take him to the intruder, after which he promised that he would save the village of Shangji and him. The tiger was even more shocked, because he had never encountered in dialogue with people who said everything so directly. After this dialogue, Li Jun and his girlfriend were already standing on the street. Joan looked at the guy and asked who the owner of the mountain really is. After all, Li Jun has repeatedly told her that this is not a monster. He just smiled and said that she might think of him as the reindeer harnessed to their sleigh. But he was a much more advanced creature. Simply put, after absorbing the magical energy coming from the gate, their personality and appearance changed. But this does not explain his ability to communicate with people, and the ability to absorb such huge volumes of magic, as well as his behavior. Li Jun understood that the girl was completely right now, because even before absorbing the magical power, he was different from other animals. So he asked if she knew who the alphas were. Their body is larger. They are smarter and stronger than other animals. So over time, alphas can become the main characters of legends and fairy tales. But the owner of Mount Baekdusen is even more special. And all because he has a patron, which greatly surprised the girl. Li Jun told her that the owner is exactly the same hunter as them. But now he is injured by an intruder who entered Mount Baekdusen. Therefore, now not only is he their target, but also the intruder who injured the owner. Without thinking twice, the girl waved her hands and directed all her strength into the air. She was very serious, so she even started screaming, ordering the world to be opened immediately. Immediately, a flash appeared in the sky in front of her, and from there came a bright white ray of sun that hit the village and was accompanied by quite loud sounds. Li Jun and her friend watched this process, and were really happy that everything was going according to plan. Suddenly, they both decided to jump up and run on very quickly. Joan decided to keep up with her boyfriend, because without him, there is nothing to do in this world and she will immediately die. Real magic was happening, and the most interesting thing was that Li Jun was absolutely confident in what he was doing, because he knew perfectly well what to expect. After the guys jumped into the newly opened world, the girl immediately waved her hands and immediately closed it so that no one else from outside would jump in there. Therefore, after a second, there was no trace left of the huge flash and sounds. The girl was very worried about them, so she hoped that they would return safe and sound, because the team had just entered the time gate. They again moved to the mine, only this time it was completely different, which was different from the one where the tiger was. Joan couldn't believe it, because could it be that a temporary gate had opened in front of her right now? But the most interesting thing is that she couldn't even understand what it was. Li Jun laughed and said that these are gates that appear inside other gates. So you shouldn't be surprised, because Korea and China are already gates in themselves. So technically all the gates in them are temporary. Joan said that it's terribly hot here, but just recently they were very cold. But June understood that she needed to calm the girl down and get her ready to work so that she wouldn't worry about trifles. So he suggested that she take this as a hardening, thanks to which they will become much stronger and more resilient. After these words, the beautiful demon immediately awarded them heat resistance, which the guy really liked, but the girl still hoped that they would also give her resistance to cold, which she simply hates. Very quickly they both rushed into battle, and the girl began to destroy the next monster that appeared on their way. When they finished, the girl turned to Li Jun with relief, noticing that their levels of power over fire were now increased. The guy assumed that the Shangji gate with strong flames was indeed ideal for leveling up. But Joan couldn't help but wonder what happened to the head of the village, and what kind of child it was, because she was the one who was able to create a sealed territory and let them in here, wasn't she? Yes, but it would be more correct to say that she did not seal the territory, but lured an intruder into it, because this place is the center of Mount Pectison, where all the power is concentrated, so the source of the power of the owner of the mountain is also located here. This girl is a bear from the myth of Tengun, so she can also use this energy for her own purposes, because she is the one who bestows this power on the owner of the mountain. Joan was shocked by this answer, because she could really imagine anything but not this. She waved her hands and began to think about the answer. It turns out that the strongest here is not the owner of the mountain, but the head of the village, right? Li Jun turned to her and said that she had analyzed everything correctly, but the intruder who was now trapped here was much stronger, although he was most likely stronger than any monster they had faced before. Joan looked at the guy with surprise in her eyes, but she couldn't believe that the name Unyo really belonged to her, because it was quite unique. Li Jun said that he doesn't know her exact name, but it doesn't matter. Unyo is just her nickname, and this child is a hero. Joan was embarrassed by this, because she understood that the world was not so huge. After all, she had just become a hero when she realized that they were now surrounding her everywhere. Xianji was the best place for the growth of the Demon King, which he himself spoke about several times in his autobiographies. So Li Jun knew full well that he had to become as strong as possible, because he would have to be prepared for any changes in the future. Therefore, he began to train hard and destroy opponents in his path. He did not spare anyone and spent all his free time on improving himself, because time had not yet played in his favor, and he needed to improve his level. Joan noticed how the guy was growing quickly and raising his level, so she also praised his patron, because he really gave him a lot of blessings. The guy turned to her and said that he considered Prince Charming a much better patron, because Li Jun becomes stronger just thanks to the player's ability. Unexpectedly, they were both very surprised, because after these words, the fallen angel decided to give the guy even more power and points for development. And also a second later, Prince Charming gave his blessing to the girl, so they were both pleasantly surprised and happy that they really had incredible patrons. Meanwhile, a girl approached the owner of the mountain and decided to ask him how he was feeling. The tiger just looked at her and said that so far everything had not changed, because he was really dying due to the fact that he used his powers to protect Mount Pyeongtasan and the village of Cheonji, and also while he was sealing the intruder. Because of this, all his life force began to melt before his eyes. The girl looked at him and said that they had to deal with those powers of Mount Pyeongtasan, but he was immediately injured, so she asked if she should take her powers back now. The tiger rose to his paws and told her not to even think about saying anything stupid. Li Jun was preparing because he understood perfectly well that although they were indeed very strong, the invader would be a much more serious opponent. Unyo asked the owner why he sent them to Shongji then. This question got him thinking, and although he didn't see his strength, he still perfectly understood who was behind Li Jun. This is about the same thing as what he saw behind the intruder's back. It was not for nothing that thunder and an earthquake appeared in the sky again. The portal opened again. A violet flame began to appear near the guys, lighting up everything around and instilling good fear. Joan was scared, because did the intruder really appear so early? From there appeared the same little girl who came to them, definitely for a reason. It seems that she began the process of preparation, because she began to look around intently and analyze the current situation. But still something worried her. Joan was even more shocked, so she asked the guy whether this little child was really the intruder she was thinking about. But Li Jun made her understand that she was very mistaken, because this is not a person at all, and you shouldn't judge a book just by its cover. Joan thought about it and simply looked in the direction of the girl. Although she was small, she used her skills very skillfully, forming lightning near her body. Immediately, she was able to summon a huge blue wolf that was behind her. The guys were shocked by such strength of a small child. Joan was scared, because she wasn't sure that they could defeat him. The girl clenched her teeth and now looked like a real monster, who was clearly no longer ready to talk to them peacefully. Therefore, without further ado, she immediately rushed into battle, realizing that she now needed to destroy the newcomers before they stopped her. Joan immediately got into a fighting stance and got ready. But she was also quite surprised when her pet jumped out and also ran away from her. He also decided to fight and protect his mistress, so he was ready to challenge the enemy. Immediately after this, they grappled with the wolf and began to fight. It was a real shock, because until that moment, it was even impossible to imagine that a pet could be so strong. Joan also shouted and rushed into battle to help, because after what happened, she's no longer afraid of anything. Therefore, without further thought, she immediately jumped up with great speed. And with all her might, she was preparing to strike at her enemy, who was not quite expecting it yet. But still, the girl jumped back and now turned her entire focus to John, who dared to challenge her. But she is not an ordinary girl, so in a fit of rage, John was preparing to strike a very accurate blow. But something stopped her. She was simply scared, because she couldn't understand what kind of force was opposing her right now. While the enemy was busy with John, Li Jun did not waste time and attacked the girl, trying to destroy her and also take her by surprise. In his eyes, you can easily see a rush of rage and extreme anger. He put all his strength into this blow, and unlike John, no one could stop his blow, and it hit the target, forming a huge fiery flame behind it. The monster jumped back and just crossed her arms, preparing to launch a counterattack. This is a truly terrible sight, but Li Jun is absolutely ready for this, and understands everything perfectly. Therefore, without waiting for an answer, he quickly rushed to the attack in order to be able to destroy the monster while he was still at a loss. A second later, everything was in huge blast waves that formed after the force of the fire. Raising your head up was indeed very scary because all that could be seen were flashes and fiery explosions. Meanwhile, at the fair there was a real earthquake from what kind of fights were taking place here. Still, the monster was very similar to the little girl, and took her image while she was in the village at the same time, and ordered everyone to evacuate immediately. The soldiers had to find shelter for people until the situation stabilized. After that, the same security guard who did not want to let Li Jun and his girlfriend through decided to jump up to her. Was he trying to see in her eyes if everything would really be okay? Although absolutely no one could answer this question now, the girl asked him not to worry, because even if everything does not go according to plan, she and the owner of the village will figure it out on their own. So now, first of all, we need to help with the evacuation. He bowed his head in front of her and said that he would do absolutely anything she ordered. She understood perfectly well that the fate of Shongji was now in their hands, because if Li Jun lost now, then she and the owner of the mountain would not be able to cope with it. Therefore, she very much hoped that everything would go well and was worried. Meanwhile, the portal unexpectedly opened again. The girl's pet was lying on the ground unconscious, and it's hard to say whether he's actually alive. Joan was sitting on the ground, resting on her knee, but she was still noticeably damaged. But that wasn't the worst thing at all. The intruder lifted Li Jun up and held him very tightly with her wolf fist. When Joan saw this, she suddenly started screaming because she was very worried about the guy. But this angered the intruder even more, so she gritted her teeth and prepared to end the guy. Li Jun just grabbed his paw and held it tightly, not allowing the enemy to grab him. It was very difficult for him. The situation was truly critical, and he needed to find a way out of it right now if he did not want to die right here. In his eyes, you could calmly see anger and despair at the same time. It looks like this is the end. He remembered that, during training, the growth of his magical powers was for some reason blocked. and there was no way to increase their level, although before they had grown well due to the flow of mana. But his mana flow was still level 1, and his power over fire had not increased either, so he concluded that it would not increase any further in Shangji. And in order to solve this problem and increase the flow of mana, he needs to sever the wolf paws of his opponent right now. After such actions, his mana flow increased, and Li Jun now gained extreme confidence in himself and his abilities, so he was now ready to fight even stronger. The intruder was scared because she noticed how her opponent changed literally before her eyes. Li Jun was able to escape from her grasp and began to form fire magic around himself. And compared to his opponent, he became much more confident. However, after being freed, he quickly looked at his body to make sure that there were no wounds or serious damage. But fortunately, everything worked out, because the flow of mana is activated in situations on the verge of death. However, it was quite difficult for Li Jun to feel something like this from the monsters he had encountered before. But as he expected, with this enemy, everything will be different, and even though it's a little too late. But mana began to envelop all his cells around his body, making it feel as if he had just been reborn again. Li Jun immediately created his magic weapon, and he prepared for the second round of their battle, where the invader was already really furious, because his victim had just literally slipped out of his hands. She got down on all fours and started growling at the guy like a real wolf, although it didn't look particularly scary. But Li Jun didn't care, so he immediately rushed into battle. But like a real gentleman, he first warned the lady that it would hurt a little. He was already ready to end this, so he summoned a flash of the sun and immediately received a huge amount of rewards and experience points, because he was able to acquire the skill without any help. Joan was very surprised because she couldn't believe that it was absorbing all the mana from the air, and the space around Li Jun was literally distorted. The guy was extremely angry, so he continued to run towards his opponent, using all his strength. But she was not even going to give up, so she also rushed into battle to take revenge and recoup the previous misunderstanding. And so their forces collided again, as usually happens when no one wants to give in to each other. The result was a huge explosion, which was to be expected. Everything around was literally on fire because two very strong elements collided. The intruder had changed very much, and it was no longer possible to see in him the very girl whose image he had replaced and wanted to impersonate. So right now, he was extremely shocked. Then another blast wave followed, which was supposed to put an end to him once and for all, freeing the owner of the mountain from suffering. But from the ashes and fire, the silhouette of a wolf suddenly appeared, which terrified. This frightened John very much, because all this could only mean one thing. The invader is winning and is not going to give up. But everything was completely different. The wolf was very angry, so he only looked towards Li Jun, trying to intimidate him with his growl. But he was absolutely fearless. He actually didn't care. He was just thinking about what he should do next. Li Jun didn't want to wait, so he went to the epicenter of the battle on his own because he didn't care. The wolf continued to growl at him, thereby trying to dissuade the guy from making such movements. Li Jun knew very well that he had approached him through the blazing flames, so now this beast could not go against his will in any way, and all this was because of his origin. The thing is that it was just a wounded animal, and its eyes, filled with anger and pain, turned into eyes full of sadness. After all, he will soon meet his owner. Li Jun looked into his lost eyes and understood perfectly well that now the fallen angel was closely watching him and his decisions. The wolf stopped growling, but only slowly began to approach the guy who would now become his new owner. Thus, Li Jun was able to subdue this beast and lure it to his side. But despite his current pliability, He was once a demon who turned the world into chaos along with the Demon King. He was an ally and follower of the demonic king, and for him, in turn, he was like his own son. Lee Jun looked at the wolf and realized that from now on, he would call him Fenrir, after which he subdued him. Anya placed her hand on the ground as she no longer heard any explosions. She realized that the vibrations had stopped, so she wondered if it was really over. Anya looked into the distance after that and noticed that her new heroes were walking along the path, who after this battle returned safe and sound. Lee Jun also carried a girl in his arms and walked towards the village. Anya was very scared, because could it be an intruder? She immediately began screaming and calling for help from the owner of the mountain, because it seemed she began to suspect that they had been betrayed right now. Joan, who was clearly not ready to fight in the village, was the most surprised by this. A large tiger immediately appeared behind Anya, who had arrived at the girl's call. Before starting a battle with them, she still wanted to know what all this meant and how Lee Jun would try to explain it all to them. He was extremely calm, so he said that he kept his promise and defeated the intruder. The tiger was also angry, so he began to growl and ask if they had deceived him. After all, they promised that they would completely destroy the invader. But Lee Jun interrupted him and said that there was no talk of destroying anyone. He recalled that he promised to save the owner of the mountain and his village, and this intruder no longer poses any threat. The girl looked at him and was pleasantly surprised by this turn of events. After that, she jumped to the ground and stood next to Lee Jun, practically preparing to take a fighting stance. The intruder's eyes lit up, but his eyes no longer posed a threat. There was no anger in them. The tiger and the girl were shocked, because they understood that now it looked like they would be fighting against two traitors at once. The intruder just glanced at Lee Jun and simply waited for further instructions from him. She then bowed her head as a sign of respect, which surprised Anya. Lee Jun smiled and asked if this was enough to make sure that he was telling the truth. The village was saved and now everything was as before. Now nothing threatened it. The intruder approached the guy and tried several times to pronounce his master's name, but nothing worked. Lee Jun found it funny to watch, but still tried to teach him to treat himself correctly. But after several minutes of unsuccessful attempts, he concluded that the intruder still could not speak. At that moment, John came to them, called the guy, and was ready to join the company. Fenrir immediately began to growl at her, but the girl raised her hands, making it clear that she was not an enemy. And it is also important to understand that the intruder only copied the image of that girl from the village, but after he was defeated by Lee Jun, he became an ordinary guy whose image has changed a little. Now his name is Fenrir, and after Joan's words, he immediately fell silent, because he understood that he was still wrong now, and there was no need to growl at her. Immediately after this, he grabbed the princess and began to shake her in different directions, like a toy. Lee Jun smiled and said that everything was fine. Don't let her worry so much. After all, these are children who want to have a little fun. But something told John that this was not the case at all. The next meeting was to take place near the lake. Anya stood there and didn't understand why Lee Jun called her here, to this particular meeting place. He looked at the lake and said that he had made a promise to the owner of the mountain that he would deal with the intruder and help with its restoration. And if he succeeds, then he intends to take her away from here, which shocked her quite a bit. She looked at the guy and understood that he really knew what he was doing, but still she was very scared. Lee Jun reassured her, said that this would not happen now, but only when he came for her as soon as he dealt with his affairs in China, so he asked her to prepare for now. He took out his sword and held it tightly in his hand. Then he just threw it into the lake for fun, because why not do that, right? Lee Jun laughed and said that the girl should take care of this sword for now, until it comes back, and it would also be great if she performed one of her rituals here. Lee Jun was very surprised, because so far she did not understand what the guy was talking about. But he wanted the sword to be safe, because he plans to give it to someone later. The next meeting was planned at the bazaar, to which Lee Jun arrived with his team, and local warriors were already waiting for them. They apologized for the last time, explaining that the foreigners who came to them before only tried to rob them all the time. Lee Jun smiled and said that he understood everything perfectly and did not hold grudges against anyone. And John added that everything was fine and there was no need to worry. Eunyo came closer to the guy and asked if they were going to leave already. Lee Jun said that he needs to move because he really doesn't have much time. But he will be back soon and will definitely take her with him. The girl could not understand what this meant. Lee Jun was a little upset by this, because Eunyo didn't remember their conversation yesterday at all. It seemed her side effects had gotten worse, so Jun said to find out about it from the owner of the mountain. Joan turned to the guy and suggested that he leave already and not linger here. Lee Jun also said that the owner of the mountain must take care of his health, because he really needs to be protected. Their road again passed through the cave. After that, the tiger's eyes only lit up and ordered Lee Jun to hurry up. Their journey was very difficult, so Lee Jun allowed Fenrir to hunt the drake for a snack. So he immediately rushed into battle so as not to waste precious time. He then took the leap, as drakes were his favorite delicacy. After which Fenrir caught fire and again looked like a monster who was definitely ready to tear his victim to pieces. The wolf he regularly turns into will not let him lie about this fact. The drake noticed the attacker, so she also quickly began to growl and react to the situation. She launched her magic blaster and pointed it towards Fenrir. The wolf felt his strength, because it was indeed very similar to his fighting style. Therefore, he ran in a rage to attack his opponent, trying to destroy him as quickly as possible. And here again, a clash of two forces occurred between them. But quite quickly, Fenrir's energy began to win this confrontation and displace the drake's energy. And the wolf won this battle, receiving a portion of the delicacy for himself. Lee Jun watched this process and was very surprised, because now he even began to doubt that Fenrir had become weaker, because he was able to defeat the huge drake so easily. But he also understood perfectly well that this was all over and he could go back. Now you need to turn your attention to the lake, in which a lot of people drowned and froze. Joan looked at this lake and decided to ask the guy what he thought about this. After all, is this really the same catastrophe that he talked about? And will the whole world really end its existence in exactly the same way? Yes, but it will be much worse. But at least now they are able to minimize the damage and save a lot of people. Lee Jun was well aware that there are many hunters and heroes who are in organizations like Asgard, where they will do anything to protect themselves and survive. So he is also willing to do whatever it takes, so there is no need to worry about it. This really calmed John down a lot. So she wiped away her tears and also promised that she would do absolutely everything in her power. After a not very pleasant conversation, it was necessary to start acting. So Lee Jun said that the ice on the lake was strong enough, and they could easily walk on it. So as soon as they crossed it, they would immediately reach their goal. But Joan still didn't quite understand where exactly their goal was. So the guy said that they were moving to the province of Gondun, where they would need to find someone there. Joan also wasn't sure if there were any survivors there, given the environment, but the guy didn't even doubt it. He holds back the black marble with a flow of mana, but at the same time, he feels his powers becoming truly much stronger. Lee Jun clenched his hand into a fist and thought seriously, because this is really his limit, because he clearly won't be able to hold back any longer. Therefore, it is very important not to waste time now. So Lee Jun immediately suggested crossing this lake as quickly as possible to find his target. They drove up the main part of the road on Fenrir, but it was time to jump off him and talk. Li Jun said that now they do not have the opportunity to ride on a wolf, since it is not worth attracting too much attention. Joan smiled and said that it is much warmer here than at the beginning of the path. And again, there are no monsters here, as before near the mountain. Li Jun laughed, because the girl herself guessed that they were moving in the right direction. While they were talking there, Fenrir just pointed his finger and said that they needed to move in that direction. The silhouette of a huge man appeared right in front of them, several times larger than them. Joan was surprised by this, because she thought that there would really be no one there. But the guy was not in the mood for jokes now, so he ordered her to prepare a weapon. Joan still didn't fully understand his intentions, because she clearly didn't expect anything like that now. Li Jun understood perfectly well that in such a place there was no way people would catch their eye. Therefore, he understood perfectly well that this was a giant that they would now have to try to destroy. Li Jun took out his weapon and prepared to attack. A few seconds later, the giant fell to the ground and the girl stopped in place. It was indeed very strange for her to realize that a giant appeared on the horizon, like a simple person. But he behaved like a hungry animal. But Li Jun reassured her, because perhaps he just broke away from the group and should not underestimate him. Although those who are usually expelled from the group due to weakness or illness often end up in a similar way. So perhaps this giant was one of them, which is why he is weaker than his colleagues. The girl was really scared to even think about it. However, suddenly something changed sharply in her eyes and she got scared. In the distance, the silhouettes of other monsters were visible. Perhaps these were the same giants. Li Jun also understood perfectly well that there was clearly much more than one of them. And John was still upset that they were not even given time to rest. But what surprised her even more was that the opponents were riding on ice drakes. It was really hard to even imagine. One of the giants came closer to them and decided to ask who they were and why they were hunting for this small rabble. The monster continued to look at the newcomers and was a little perplexed. Li Jun smiled and looked at Fenrir, who was clearly special, because even in such a tense situation, he wanted to taste the drake. After that, the giant threw a large net in their direction, trying to catch the guys. Joan noticed this and was shocked, but she had to act quickly. She prepared herself for battle and was ready to attack. But Li Jun put his hand on her shoulder and told her to calm down. The thing is that he does not feel any thirst for blood at all. The giant just grabbed Li Jun in his net and looked at him. After that, his eyes lit up and he said that now Li Jun and his entire team will have to come with him to check. The giants rode on drakes and led the children along. They laughed at them and discussed their affairs, which worried them much more than ordinary people. However, after a while, the leader decided to communicate with them, asking if they were local, so they immediately answered him that they came from distant lands. The giant calmly believed this, because he understood perfectly well that they had been captured with someone special, so he told the guys not to worry about their safety. Li Jun was a little surprised, because he understood perfectly well that they are different from the giants from the stories, because they are really very smart, unlike the records where they are described as simple monsters. So the guy decided to immediately ask if they could take them to a guard. The giant looked at him and was very surprised because the guy already knew about their city, especially since they were heading there right now, so he told them not to worry about it, and also added that they did not have the slightest desire to harm them. Therefore, the giant waved his hand and introduced himself, saying that his name was Shachi. He is a proud warrior of a great tribe of frost giants. Li Jun also smiled back and said his name. Suddenly, their conversation changed dramatically, and a real monster appeared in front of them, whose eyes were burning and the desire to destroy only intensified. He was clearly furious, so he was already preparing to attack. After another second, he and his comrades were already lying on the ground. Shaki was very strong, so he dealt with the uninvited guests who dared to interrupt their dialogue. Li Jun was a little surprised, because the strength of his interlocutor was also really impressive. Shachi turned his head and also looked at the guy with suspicion. But then his mood changed sharply and he was ready to continue the dialogue. Li Jun was surprised because he didn't understand a little how to react correctly to all this, and how to make sure that the enemy did not get angry over trifles, so as not to provoke a conflict. The giant continued to look at the cage and became very serious. Still, it was clear that something was bothering him, so he asked the guys for permission to ask them a few questions, after which he could let them go. Li Jun suspected that Shachi was hiding something, but there must still be survivors in the city of giants. Shachi began to swear on the honor of his name, and also repeated several times that the guys could make their own choices, and he would do absolutely nothing to them, regardless of their decision. Li Jun extended his hand clenched into a fist in response, and he understood perfectly well that it looked like they would get to their goal much easier than they had planned, because right now they were heading there. Joan was also pleasantly surprised and shocked by what she saw. Shachi smiled proudly and said that now they had arrived at the place and this was their city. He began to admire it and greeted its new visitors. Everything was covered in snow, but in fact, it looked really very beautiful. At first glance, one could assume that it was just a difficult-to-guard castle. Although this was partly true, because the entrance to the city passed through a well-guarded gate, where Shachi was the first to ride on a drake. People rejoiced at his arrival and immediately ran to meet him at the entrance. Li Jun and John began to look around and analyze the situation. At the entrance, a guy and a girl also began to wait for them, who looked quite friendly. Another friend went to draw water from the well. Joan smiled because it really felt like they were in the Middle Ages. She looked around and asked Li Jun not to talk about the fact that they had made this journey through space and time. Meanwhile, local residents looked at the new arrivals and were very surprised, because why did people come to them locked in a cage? Had they really done something? Meanwhile, Fenrir became a real monster and became very angry with them. They were shocked, because they could not believe that there was a special one with them now. Could Shachi really manage to catch him? But Shachi told them not to worry, because they just wanted to visit the leader now, so let them get off the road for now. Li Jun laughed and patted his new friend on the head, telling him not to worry about this yet, because everything is really good and they are not in danger now. But Fenrir continued to repeat to himself that this was an enemy that must be destroyed immediately. Li Jun was very surprised by these words, because he couldn't believe it. Was there really an enemy there? The building at the main entrance began to shine and be wrapped in magic, which was truly quite an amazing sight. There were guards at the entrance, whom Shachi ordered to inform him that he had arrived. After that, the doors at the main entrance opened, and the giant began to walk along the path towards the leader, carrying in his hands a cage with new arrivals. The leader sat on his throne and waited for Shachi to come closer to him and report the stop. For now, he was shocked and angry, because he could not believe that Shachi had brought another uninvited guest to the city. Fenrir began to get very angry, so Li Jun concluded that it was him that the guy was talking about. It must be him he fought with before he got to Mount Paektusen. Shachi knelt down and looked at the leader, saying that he had brought the werewolf and his companions to him. It looks like he wants to stay with them. The leader was truly shocked by such information, because he refused to believe it. He started waving his arms because he couldn't believe that these two were able to defeat this werewolf. But Shachi said that it was exactly like that. The leader began to get angry and ordered the warrior to immediately leave the uninvited guests and go back. Shachi just looked at him and said that he made his promise that everything would be fine and no one would harm them. So he was extremely insistent that the leader should not do anything like that. The leader fell into even greater rage at such words, but Shachi continued to say that after the dialogue, These guys should return back safe and sound. Shachi bowed his head as a sign of respect and only asked the leader to preserve his name and rank as a warrior without breaking this promise. It got dark quite quickly, so people started turning on the lights in their rooms. The girl began to open the doors, but everything was closed. She understood that if she really wanted to open them, she could easily do it. But Li Jun said that in this way she would turn the entire tribe of giants against her, and even if she was so confident in herself, now she still continues to be in their possessions. Joan just waved her hands and was surprised by this answer, because aren't they locked in a cage right now and in trouble? Joan said that it doesn't matter how Li Jun looks at this situation, but she feels very well that their leader still has really bad intentions towards them, especially after what Fenrir's reaction was to him. She was absolutely sure that the leader felt pressure on him, but she just watched as Fenrir warmed himself by the fireplace and thought what they would need to do now. Li Jun jumped on the bed and told her not to worry about this at all, because if they want to leave this place, they can do so at any time. But for now, they just need to rest after such a difficult journey. He smiled and understood that, apparently, they were here for a really long time. Everything was on fire. The buildings were simply collapsing before our eyes. It was a terrible process that really leaves huge psychological problems in the future. Terrible monsters came who were ready to destroy everything that got in their way. Li Jun walked up and looked out the window, because in the records of the demonic king, the war with the giants was described as one of the most terrible wars. But there were still nuances that he really could not understand. He was absolutely sure that their king was incredibly strong, but individually, almost all giants are inferior to humans in strength, so it is not clear how they managed to drive humanity into a corner. There was a fairly loud sound near the door. Li Jun had to look away from his thoughts and look in that direction. It was a little girl who brought tea to the guy. She laid out everything she needed on the table and began pouring the drink into a mug. It was clear that she was a little worried, because she began to stutter and repeat the same phrases several times, asking whether such a volume would be enough. Li Jun was sitting at a huge table with his girlfriend, but he became very curious. Are all new girls really accepted in this way? The servants refused and said that today was an exception, so Li Jun had a completely logical question. Why do this then? She crossed her arms and began to explain the situation to him. Li Jun smiled and told her not to worry, because now everything is fine and no one is watching her, so she can tell everything as it really is. The girl was surprised and frightened by this, but still did not understand how this was possible. The thing is that no one had noticed the surveillance tools before. Li Jun smiled and said that this is a fairly standard magical tool, and if he were here alone, and he might not even have guessed about it. However, he still has a necklace that belongs to Merlin, who is the strongest magician. Therefore, he got down on his knee and decided to talk to the girl, who had already said that her name was Siyun, and also said again that everything was completely safe and no one was listening in on anything, so she had no reason to worry. However, once she left this room, she would still have to not tell anyone about this conversation. Sun told the guy that she had been here for more than a year, but many people had been stuck here for several years. It turns out that more than a year has already passed since people discovered Utgard. But still Li Jun also decided to ask why then there is such a special attitude towards them now. Sun tightly clenched her hand into a fist and said that all this was thanks to the incredible strength of the guy, because giants really like strong people, and they are also glad that a special guest came with them. Fenrir just sat on a chair and listened a little to the conversation, where Seal continued to say that recently Utgard was attacked by the Nars. But at that moment, Fenrir quickly turned into a monster and killed many giants. After this, the king of the giants decided to fight Fenrir to stop him, So all the giants simultaneously confronted the guy and won. Li Jun now understood perfectly well that it was for this reason that Fenrir retreated towards Mount Pektusen. He waved his hand and asked Sayun to do a small favor for him, where in return he would give sweets. But the girl refused and said that she was not at all interested. Her look changed a lot, and she was upset. But she still asked Li Jun for the iron, because if she sold it, she could buy medicine for her mother. Li Jun agreed without any problems, but in return asked her to find someone named Manhwa for himself. She was extremely shocked by this proposal, because was he really asking her to go and find Manhwa now? But only Vada came to her mind, so she decided to clarify whether it was necessary to find him. Li Jun just smiled and said that this was exactly what he needed. Indeed, several days have passed since their arrival at Utgard Castle, and during this time the Li Jun group has done absolutely nothing. Every time they went for a walk at the same time, they were brought food, and they fully enjoyed life, as if at a resort. Joan was already starting to get very annoyed by this, because why were they here then? And also, if the giants needed absolutely nothing from them, then why didn't they just let them go? Li Jun turned to her and said that thanks to this, they got a slight advantage and were able to practice at least a little. Isn't that great? The girl agreed with this, but still she preferred to die rather than live the rest of her days in a cage. Jun looked at her and hinted that he would definitely not let her get bored. After that, he prepared for the fight and said that now was just a great opportunity to demonstrate his strength. Joan was delighted, because now can they really raze everything in this city to the ground and get out to freedom? The guy laughed and asked where she got such positive thoughts, because how could such a sweet girl strive to raze everything to the ground? It looks like she really doesn't like this place. She didn't deny this, because here they didn't even see people, but only giants. And besides, she doesn't like the king at all, whose behavior clearly infuriates her, so she still suspects that something is clearly wrong here. Li Jun really began to understand that it looks like the girl is right now. So now their main goal will be to try to figure out what is wrong here. And for this, a great idea would be to stage a show of force. He smiled and his eyes lit up, so he insisted on fighting at least one round. Joan was shocked by such a proposal, because all this time she thought that the guy was joking, and she was not at all ready to fight him, because she knew how strong he was. He stood opposite her and said that he understood what she was thinking about now, because they had never fought seriously before. Joan also calmly understood this, but still did not understand why she needed to do this. Li Jun saw her mood and was very upset that the girl didn't want to fight at all. So he asked her if she was really that unsure of herself and her abilities. Joan thought about it and was ready to cry. But she still decided to pull herself together and start a battle, so she swung her sword and prepared to also enter into a duel, saying that the guy would greatly regret such a challenge. Therefore, she immediately rushed into battle, adding that even if she did not win, she would definitely not give up very easily. Li Jun smiled and also began to fight with her, saying that if victory really was his, then she would be owed. He swung his spear and sent the forces of fire towards her. Joan was ready for such a turn of events, so she tried to concentrate so as not to miss anything important. Her eyes lit up, so she was ready to continue the attack, saying that the same conditions would apply to Li Jun if he was defeated. Meanwhile, snow continued to fall in the city, and there was a fairly pleasant atmosphere where nothing foreshadowed trouble. Suddenly their training went too far, and they either intentionally or accidentally hit the building with enormous force. Shachi talked with the other giants and laughed, because they joked about the fact that the castle had never been in ruins. But a second later, the explosion still occurred, and the building was partially destroyed. A lot of time and effort will be spent on its restoration. Li Jun was a little surprised, because he and his friend clearly did not expect such an effect. Shachi, when he heard that the people he brought destroyed half of the castle's gardens, laughed even more. He was really interested in seeing the face of his leader to see his reaction. By uniting the tribes, he began to change. The leader demanded that he be called not a leader, but a king, and as soon as he began to mine iron, he immediately began to gather an army. However, no one knew who the war was against. And Shachi, who all the time fought for him only from noble motives, could not understand the motives of his leader. He just looked at the castle and told his comrade with a smile that he hoped that the leader really chose his enemies wisely. His partner suddenly started screaming and informed his commander that the path was starting to close right now. Commander Shaki understood that it seemed like right now was the right time, so he needed to start acting. Now a real preventive conversation will take place in the castle building. Joan sat opposite the huge bike, as if on a date. He looked at her and tried to find the right words. But everything was completely different. She was called in order to explain that such behavior is a huge sin to cause such harm to the castle gardens. But they also perfectly understood that their mistake was also in this, because initially they did not indicate to them their right. So she immediately apologized for her behavior. Joan didn't know how much they knew about humans, so she decided to tell them that they have a tradition where they run around the forest and train. The giant understood everything perfectly well, but Joan decided to continue apologizing, saying that she was really very sorry that they had caused such damage to the castle gardens, so in the future they would be much more careful. She looked at her interlocutor and said that she really wanted to correct her guilt, so she wondered what else she could do for him. The giant thought about it because it would be quite good to compensate for this, so he asked her to tell her more about her team. After all, given what happened, he and all other residents of this city became interested in learning about them in more detail, so more information is needed. Joan smiled and said that she could implement it without any problems. Li Jun fought her quite skillfully, although he gave in and tried to teach her. The girl also did not give up and put up her sword to protect herself from the blow. Joan missed several serious blows and was a little damaged, although she herself perfectly understood that she needed to hit much harder and more accurately in order to somehow resist the guy. She really had a lot of motivation to win, so the girl didn't think twice and immediately ran into a counterattack. After which the same explosion occurred, which destroyed the garden. As expected, nothing else could be expected from Li Jun back then. Although he understood that they were now having a friendly duel, he still got used to the role quite well and did not calculate the strength of his blows. Joan saw that now was a pretty good opportunity to attack and tried to take advantage of it. So she immediately ran into the smoke. It was fundamentally important for her to strike and lose with dignity, since it was truly impossible to defeat such an opponent. After another second, another strong explosion occurred, which put everything in its place. After that, Li Jun stopped and calmed down. Joan did exactly the same. It was clear that she was upset that she had lost, but it was unlikely that she could seriously count on defeating the guy. Li Jun smiled and told her that she fought really well, and it was a pretty good fight. Nevertheless, he now decided to clarify whether she would do what he asked of her. Joan agreed to complete the task without any problems, because she lost, but wanted to learn more about it. Therefore, Li Jun asked her to pretend that she was cooperating with the city leaders and gather more information about them. Joan watched him carefully and listened to what he said. Meanwhile, security guards rushed to the scene and noticed that the gardens were burning. They were shocked, because this had never happened before, since for all residents of the city this is a terrible sin. From the smoke, Joan's face could be seen standing over Li Jun, who was on his knees and was broken, and also mentally depressed due to his loss. The guards believed this, so they immediately ordered a doctor to be called for him. after which Li Jun was transferred to the ward and began to be examined, as well as to find out what happened. The doctor analyzed his condition, but noticed that there was absolutely no serious injury on the patient's body, only small scratches and minor wounds. Li Jun smiled, although he understood that the doctor did not fall for this cheap game, but those giants definitely believed in it. So he continued talking to the doctor and asked him to help heal the wounds. So the doctor put his hand on his shoulder and began to treat him. A second later, the wounds on the body began to heal. Li Jun understood that the doctor, with his technique, not only stopped the bleeding, but also completely healed all the wounds. The doctor was happy that the patient felt better, and a girl who was also watching the process ran up to him. Li Jun said that it was indeed a great honor for him to meet him, because it was the same Vata. The doctor was a little surprised, because he was not used to strangers immediately addressing him by name, even though he had not introduced himself. Therefore, his view and form of communication changed dramatically, and he also decided to find out more from the guy. How did he know about him? Li Jun decided to play dumb and say that he didn't know anything about him, so the doctor began to believe that the guy found out about him thanks to Sion. Li Jun smiled and said that actually no, but it would be better if they could get to know each other better. But Hada only got angry because another stupid person was sitting in front of him again. He turned around and told Sion that they were leaving and wouldn't even waste their time on it. Li Jun got out of bed and said that he was still sick. Do they really want to leave a patient here who hasn't been treated properly? Shvara thought about it and told him not to pretend, because he did not at all look like a person who needed treatment. Li Jun told him that the wound is not external, but why is he diagnosing him like that even if he didn't even examine his organs? Fata was shocked because he was really to blame for this situation. He took Li Jun's hand and first decided to take his pulse. The doctor's eyes changed again, and he fully concentrated on the process. After that, he took his hand back and said that he still saw absolutely no problem. So he got ready to leave and closed the doors behind him. Li Jun was even scared for the first time, because he definitely felt the magical power that came from him. So there is absolutely no doubt that he is a hunter. But has Vata really not yet received his abilities? After checking Li Jun's organs, he still didn't notice anything. But how is this possible? After all, this is definitely Vata. Jun thought about it. After all, this is the same trader of Grab, who was one of the surviving hunters of China, and also the one who healed many heroes and the Demon King, after which the Demon King activated the flow of mana in the lands of the giants. Many say that he experienced a rush of mana at the beginning of the activation, so it may have been something similar to a side effect of dragon blood. But the Demon King was able to go through all of this as with the help of a grasp that was so good that it could even be called a god. Li Jun thought about it and was a little scared, because had he really come too early and Vata had not yet been able to achieve that power due to lack of time? Joan approached the guy in the meantime and wanted to talk. The guy was happy about her arrival, because he thought that she would have problems because of the situation in the garden. But fortunately, everything worked out, so he decided to ask her how everything went. Joan smiled and said that everything was just great. She looked at the guy and said that the giants now want her to become their hired warrior. Joan told the guy that the ice giants, who call themselves Nars, are now building a city nearby and are looking for an opportunity to attack Utgard. Well, the locals want to protect the city from them and other monsters, but they don't have many warriors, so they ask for their help. Li Jun thought, because the number of giants is much less than he could imagine, and because of the Nars, it continues to decrease. It must be difficult for them to harm humanity because of this. Joan said that the giant also asked her a lot about the outside world, namely about the population, culture, and armed forces. Li Jun looked at her and praised her for doing such a good job. But John also wanted to know if the guy was able to get any information. So far, he hasn't succeeded yet, but he will definitely try to do it. After that, they immediately had to return as soon as they found the people they came for. But accepting an offer to become a warrior is really impressive. So he decided to ask John if this is the main reason why she is going to stay here. She said that the giants do not offend people here at all. But if people leave Utgard, they will simply die. Perhaps that is why they do not leave this place, and we need to find a way to help them. Lee Jun was shocked by this answer, because he planned to take several giants with him after he found Grab. After that, he wanted to escape from Utgard, but the girl was much kinder than him, which pleasantly surprised him. Sacrificing the few for the sake of the many sounds good enough. But Lee Jun practically did what he hates most. By signing the contract as a mercenary warrior, he was able to stay here with other people. They looked at him and were very surprised, because they couldn't believe what the wolf's owner had forgotten here. They had to look away, because they were really afraid and worried about themselves and their lives, because he looked very dangerous. Lee Jun felt this very well, but could not do anything about it, because no one likes strangers, and it seems they are not welcome here at all. However, Sayun came running to them. She was very joyful and wanted to talk urgently. She thanked the guy for helping her mother, who felt much better. Lee Jun was very happy with this answer, but what came next surprised him even more. Dr. Shvata also came, who smiled and asked the guy how he was feeling. Lee Jun extended his hand and said that everything was already much better thanks to his help. Afterwards, they shook hands and thanked each other. Shvata said that the guy can find him at any time if he suddenly becomes ill, and he will see what's wrong with him and provide first aid. After that, they turned around and went in the opposite direction. Lee Jun clenched his hand into a fist as he was very angry. But still, he calmed down and exhaled. He deliberately redirected the flow of his mana in his presence, but again, he did not notice anything. Lee Jun understood perfectly well that Hwada should have noticed that something was wrong here. But did he really understand something wrong about the old man? Joan noticed that the guy was standing really very sad and worried, so she decided to ask what was bothering him and how she could help. Still, he didn't answer, so she asked him not to worry and promised that they would definitely find the one he was looking for. Lee Jun was delighted to receive such support. After that, he looked at his girlfriend and suggested that she just collect more information about this place for now. Lee Jun approached the local residents and wanted to find out how many giants live here, where he was told that there are about 1,000 of them. But his second interlocutor said that this is complete nonsense, because there are definitely tens of thousands of giants here. Lee Jun also wanted to ask them who the Nairs are. The guy looked at him and said that in Utgard there were always much more giants, about 4 times. But at one point, skirmishes began between the giants and one of the leaders took a group of giants and left, after which they began to call them Nars. Lee Jun also really needed to know what happened to those who did not stay here and become Nars. They all died fighting each other. Some of them were even struck down by some kind of disease, because they could not adapt to these lands and simply died from diseases. Lee Jun understood what all this meant due to infectious diseases and tried to collect as much information as possible in this way. Therefore, he decided to clarify whether other strangers came here besides them, but they told him that they had already come here, which surprised and frightened him very much, because he began to think about only one person. What if it was the Demon King? After all, the diary said that he visited China and arrived in the city of giants. Perhaps he can find some traces of its existence, since Lee Jun is now in the past. The guys told him that there were several people here, but they left, and they had never seen them with their own eyes. So these were just the words of the giants, who also found several intruders, who immediately disappeared after that. Lee Jun smiled, because this is really valuable information, and you will need to find out more about it from the giants, And he also invited the guys to tell them about what was going on outside. After the conversation, he began to walk back, since everything went really very efficiently. Lee Jun understood perfectly well that there was clearly someone here who was able to stop the spread of infection among the giants. Someone who is very often called to this castle. So the grab he is looking for must turn out to be this person. The guy understood perfectly well that only giants could give him information about this. Shaki looked at Lee Jun, who began to approach him. And he started laughing hard because they destroyed the gardens in the castle. He thanked him for helping the giants, despite the fact that they are not even of the same species, because the dwarves and other guys from Banir hate them, and he also said that today he would need to go outside. Lee Jun didn't quite understand what he meant. Shachi explained that the Nars' attacks were becoming more frequent, so they needed to fight, and also invited Lee Jun to join them to help. The guy just looked at him and smiled, because he didn't mind at all. Therefore, the giants together with Lee Jun left the castle territory to stop another attack by the Nars. And they encountered a very unexpected guest. After all, the leader of the Nars tribe named Shrin appeared before them. He got off the drake and took a few steps towards him. After which, Shaki did exactly the same. They met halfway to negotiate. The leader looked into Shachi's eyes and tried to convince him to withdraw his troops and take his side. Shaki was slightly frightened, because he did not expect that now he would have to confront the leader, because no one was expecting his appearance. Lee Jun also realized that this could be quite dangerous, since this giant's name is Shrin. He's a real monster, who is also extremely strong. He is much stronger than Shachi. Perhaps Shrin can easily measure his strength with the king of the giants from the castle. So Lee Jun thought about learning their language, because he could not understand at all what they were talking about. Therefore, while he was watching them, the fallen angel awarded the guy a new skill and gave him knowledge of the Estonian language. The leader could not understand why Shachi did not want to change his decision, but he started shouting and saying that he saw no point in listening to a traitor. The leader was shocked, because was he really going to continue listening to this stupid king? He was very sorry that their tribe had fallen so low, because they disgraced the name of the warrior, and he also corrected Shachi, saying that they were not traitors, but only considered themselves the masters of Utgard. Shaki could not stand it and began to shout at him, ordering him to stop immediately and not say anything, since he was no longer able to listen to it. His eyes lit up and he immediately took out his weapon, preparing to fight. The leader agreed with him, because they were used to solving issues in a completely different way, after which he also prepared for battle. Suddenly, Srina's gaze went to the side. He saw a special one named Fenrir, and was shocked, because he really obeys people, and is also a human? Sreen was very interested in watching this, so he said that they would definitely have to see each other next time. Shaki could no longer stand it, so he began to shout at the leader, ordering him to immediately stop talking and start fighting. He didn't mind, although he understood that his opponents were now driven by emotions of rage. Therefore, a battle immediately began between them, where Shachi was the first to strike and engage in battle. Srin was also furious, so he concentrated and rushed to attack. From what he saw, fear could be seen in Shachi's eyes, since Srin hit him with his hand with great force, which Shachi clearly could not have expected. He looked at Shachi, who was in shock and realized that he had just won an easy victory. Then he stopped and smiled and said that they would definitely see him again and fight. Well, also with a special person and his special person. Shachi was shocked, so he simply silently listened to the leader's words and looked into his eyes, which greatly surprised his warriors, who requested at least permission to pursue them. It was hard for Shachi to say anything, because he understood that Srin was much stronger than him, and going there would be tantamount to death. Therefore, he turned to the soldiers and explained that as long as Srin was with them, there was no point in fighting them, because they would only lose soldiers if they entered the battle. And although this is sad, the leader himself directly ordered to avoid clashes with him, so the Nair's army simply left the territory on their drakes. The giants were very upset by this decision, because they could not believe that this was possible. They all understood perfectly well that they had just been humiliated once again, so they returned home with such a feeling of helplessness. Li Jun understood that they looked really defeated, but Shachi was right, because the giants may be hostile and enjoy battles, but their strength difference is too great. The Nair's chief and Shachi looked like they were very close before, like close friends or brothers. Li Jun thought, is it really a person standing in their way? The giants must have definitely noticed him, but they don't seem to care. But what is he doing there? Li Jun pointed his finger at the guy and asked Shachi, who is he? This was a simple mercenary warrior, exactly the same as Li Jun and his girlfriend, who is in the service of Utgard. He turned to him and asked if he was still in search of medicinal herbs. The guy turned to him and said that they were exactly what he was looking for, which surprised Li Jun, because perhaps this was the one he had been looking for so long. Shachi waved his hand and warned him that the Nairs were wandering nearby, and it was very dangerous to be here, so he invited him to return with them. The guy smiled kindly and thanked him for the offer, because he was just about to return, but he also decided to ask who was going with Shachi. The commander smiled and said that this was Li Jun, who is now Utgard's new mercenary. He also said that this was Dr. Quada and introduced him to Li Jun, who was very happy at this turn of events, because he was finally able to find him. Very quickly they arrived back at the castle, where John was already waiting for them, who already missed them quite a lot, in particular, Li Jun. He came in and immediately noticed that the girl looked very happy. So she said that today, while hunting, she was ambushed by the Nars, but they got scared and started running away from her. Li Jun still told her that he had a completely different situation, so they didn't even fight because they met an enemy leader who was extremely strong. Joan was a little upset, but also said that there were also people among those who attacked her. Li Jun was very surprised by this, because how is this possible? Among them was a Chinese who was able to deflect her blow and protect everyone, as if it were not a powerful blow with a two-handed weapon, but with a feather. In addition, she said that he used a spear, but it was longer than Li's and also quite strangely shaped. The guy was surprised by this, because who could be the Chinese hunter who could easily repel Joan's attack? He couldn't even think that any other people could survive here. But still, he also came across a person. Joan noticed that the guy still looked unhappy, so she decided to ask him what was wrong. Li Jun thought about it, because he wanted to go and talk with Vata, but he was worried that something might go wrong again, so he invited John to go with him to be on the safe side. She of course agreed, but she understood that even if she went, she would understand absolutely nothing in their language. But Li Jun took out his pendant and handed it to her, asking her to do a favor for him. He said that this was Merlin's necklace, which would easily allow her to understand their language, and he was absolutely confident that she could handle it. Meanwhile, there was a huge line of people entering one building. It was a hospital where everyone was screaming and calling for help from Vat, and the old doctor was panicking and simply asking the patient to be patient a little longer. Vata was completely immersed in the process and understood that very soon the warrior would be able to come to his senses. Li Jun understood that in China, doctors who succeed in their field are called Huada, and now he understands perfectly why, but he still wondered why there were so many patients here. Still, despite them, he decided to approach and communicate with Vata. He turned his head and said that he was extremely busy right now, and asked Li Jun to come over later. But he only took out a huge bag of magic potions and handed it to the doctor. He smiled and said that this should help, and also suggested that he use them as he saw fit. Vata was surprised, because there were too many of them and thanked the guy for his help. Thanks to the potions brought by Li Jun, Hwada was able to heal a huge number of patients. And after all this, they had the opportunity to talk normally. Vada left the hospital and asked Li Jun to give him the opportunity to measure his pulse. But the guy didn't understand why he wanted to do this. Shvata said that perhaps he was deluding himself, but he couldn't shake the idea that he felt something strange after they shook hands. Li Jun was happy because he was finally able to find the guy he had been looking for so long, and kindly gave him his hand. Vada thought a lot after that. He looked at Li Jun and warned him that it might be a little unpleasant. But there were some things to check, which he had no problem agreeing with and didn't mind. After these words, Vat's eyes lit up. He held the guy's hand tightly and concentrated on the process. I immediately remembered the situation where Li Jun holds his hands on Joan's shoulders and transfers a flow of mana to her, which is not an easy process. The guy understood perfectly well that Vada was now using mana to check his pulse and his condition in general, but he did not feel any discomfort at all, as if it were his mana. After this, Shava abruptly took his hand back, because he was shocked and understood perfectly well that it looked like an unusual person was standing in front of him, the one he needed. Hwada was shocked and even a little scared, so he asked Li Jun if it was really him. The guy looked at him and understood perfectly well that Shvata was also the one he was looking for. Therefore, Hwata decided to ask if Li Jun had also studied ki cultivation, and he only responded by asking if Hwata had studied mana flow, and how the first one was completely bewildered when he heard about the flow of mana. The second one had exactly the same condition. That is why their conversation moved back into the building, since talking on the street was not at all advisable. After this, Li Jun decided to find out how the guy was able to come up with the flow of mana, but Hwata explained to him that they call it ki cultivation. But what do we mean? Are there really several of them? Therefore, Jun decided to find out who else besides his interlocutor knew about the flow of mana. No. Or rather, about the cultivation of ki. Shvata said that people on the Nar's side also know about this. Li Jun immediately remembered the stories from John, who also met a person on her way during the battle, and understood that the situation was indeed very strange. Therefore, the guy decided to ask if Shvata noticed something on him when he checked his pulse. He was surprised because Li's blood was extremely thick, and the flow of internal energy was unnatural. But still he noticed that he had not fully studied the guy and decided to ask if something was bothering him. Li Jun understood perfectly well that in front of him was the one who was able to heal the Demon King, so he could definitely be trusted. He said that he had problems while cultivating his internal energy. A huge amount of demonic energy released by the monsters flowed through his body, and it mixed with other energies of other origins inside his body and transformed into black marble spheres. And when these balls begin to release strong energy, his body begins to experience enormous pain. He looked at Eva and said that he had no idea what these balls were, but cultivating internal energy was absolutely useless. Shvata thought about it and realized that then he needed to take the next step. He looked at his interlocutor and asked his permission to re-examine the body, but this time in full, so he decided to warn him that it could be dangerous. Li Jun smiled and said that everything is fine, and he is not worried. Therefore, Shvata asked him to lie down on the bed and take off his outer clothing. He understood that Li must have felt like his organs were being torn apart, but he was able to bear it well. The guy just looked at him and wanted to know how it all went. Hwata said that the black spheres inside the body are very unique. Usually they absorb all the life energy of a person until he dies, but the spheres inside Li Jun are completely different because on the contrary they stimulate the flow of mana inside him. Li Jun was surprised because he didn't understand what this could really mean. Vata said that they really do not cause him much harm, But the reason why he experiences pain is because of the forced changes in the flows within the mana. However, he noticed that this is quite dangerous, because the spheres become stronger along with him, which surprised Li. Therefore, Wada warned him that if the spheres became stronger than Li Jun at any point, they would simply suppress him as an entity. After this, he will become a true psychopath who will be consumed by the desire to kill. But surprisingly, with his unusual mental toughness, he is able to suppress it easily. Li Jun decided to find out if the psychopathy that Fatah spoke about is connected with the one that haunts the Nars abandoned in the ice. Fatah looked at him and sadly lowered his head. People on the Nair side are psychopaths, obsessed with the desire to destroy everything in their path and the cultivation of internal energy. Still, Li Jun was indeed able to collect a lot of new information, which he has not yet understood, but still it will definitely be useful to him. He understood that the black spheres were safe, and also helped him improve. It's really a natural process where you start to improve while facing danger, so he concluded that everything was fine. He wondered if the Demon King could learn about the flow of mana by studying ki cultivation. Li Jun began to get dressed, but he knew that if this was really the case, then through ki cultivation in the future, he would also be able to improve his mana flow, so he needed to talk to the doctor even more. Fatah didn't mind doing this, because he also has a few more questions regarding Li Jun. But first, it was necessary to completely close all the doors to the room, so that there were no prying eyes and ears. Jun sat opposite him and asked about patients who did not even participate in battles. But then why are they all sick? Fatah took a mug of coffee and said that there is too much energy here. Where hunters under the supervision of patrons can benefit from such a place if they are used to energy, but ordinary people are not able to cope with such amounts of energy, which is why they begin to get sick. Is that why there are so many sick people here? The thing is that with the advent of the gates, lands unsuitable for human life began to appear all over the world. Before China experienced the gatification, Quada studied medicine in Europe and returned to his homeland after news of everything reached him, in the hope that he would be useful. Outside of these lands, everyone called them unrecoverable, hellish lands and the realm of monsters. So he looked at Li Jun with fear in his eyes and decided to ask why he actually came all the way here, and also wanted to know if the rescue group would come for him. Jun thought about it, because in history there was not a single mention of a rescue group. So he decided to tell the guy that there would definitely be no rescue group. His appearance changed dramatically after these words, and he became very upset. But Li Jun decided to cheer him up, because she actually already exists and is right here. Fatah couldn't believe it, but Li Jun smiled and understood that for now it would be difficult for his interlocutor to even imagine this. Vada was depressed, so he asked Li Jun not to talk nonsense, because he perfectly understood that there were only two of them. But he said that Vada was clearly mistaken, since in addition to Fenrir there are two more who have already shown the giants their strength, as well as one of they are not human at all, so it would be more correct to say that they are skeletons. Shvata understood that it makes no difference whether it is a group or one person, since nothing changes this. And the main problem is that they must save everyone. But will they cope? Li Jun replied that no. So Vava began to say why he even started telling him about this, but Li interrupted him and continued to say that he definitely couldn't handle it alone. Shvata understood that the guy was, right now, inviting him to join his team. Li Jun asked Vat to tell him more about the people on Narsov Island, since he would definitely need their help. Shvata began to get nervous, because this was really a rather ridiculous act. Because how can you talk about it if he doesn't know anything about them? Li Jun just smiled and said that this is precisely the reason he is asking, because the number of surviving hunters living in Utgard is too small. which means that most of them are on the side of the Nares, right? Vada thought about it and said that he did not know this because he went out to collect medicinal herbs. And when he returned, he found out that most of the hunters had left Utgard. Li Jun tried to figure out who could be the person who could lead all these hunters, but absolutely no one came to mind. Vada's gaze reminds him of his past, because in it he feels despair from his powerlessness in the desire to save people, since Vada really wanted to help. In order to take all the people with them and escape, they need the help of these hunters, because they must prepare for the upcoming cataclysm and become even stronger. So he turned to Vada and asked him to teach him how to use Q cultivation. He was shocked by this, because no one had ever asked him for anything like this before. Li Jun knew that if he could study it, he would be one step closer to the Demon King's power. Therefore, to implement this idea, it was first necessary to leave the castle grounds and go outside. And so, the first training session went quickly enough, and, having scattered the stones, they immediately finished. Vada said that he had erected a barrier around this area, so that no flow of mana would definitely leak out. So even if they trained inside, no one would suspect anything. Li Jun looked around and asked if something like this was really necessary for his training. Vada said that this is another necessary safety measure, because internal changes require the absorption of energy around, and also during this process. Due to huge changes in energy, one of the giants may notice this. And since collecting energy in one place is not an easy task, first they will need to put a barrier to the natural flow of mana around. But he began to worry a little because is there really something wrong? Li Jun said that everything was fine. He was just also thinking, because all this time he was also feeling and collecting the energy that naturally flowed around. Wada was very surprised by this. So he asked the guy not to tell him that he collected energy without a special technique, and also asked him to tell about his teacher and the special technique of internal energy that he was taught. Because this is impossible. But Li Jun was only surprised and asked, "What is so incredible about this?" Wada said that Li Jun seemed to have an incredible ability to control internal energy, because although he felt that it was entertaining, it still exceeded his expectations. He smiled, because this really made him happy. Li Jun was still at a loss, because he didn't understand what made him so happy. Vada explained that although his technique was impressive, after listening to Li, he began to realize that it really seemed possible, and they could actually solve this problem. Meanwhile, in the Nars camp, a dialogue took place between the hunters. One of them began to ask, "Do they really think that there are no strong hunters among Utgard?" That's right, the mustache convinced him of this. After that, the guy thought a little, because maybe they had already sent a rescue group? It seems that this is not the case at all, because if this was a rescue group, then there would be no chance that the Nars would not notice them. So most likely this is a small team that consists of a maximum of 10 people. He couldn't understand what was going on here now and what he needed to prepare for. The guy understood perfectly well that for some reason, he was very careless about everything. But now he cannot even imagine in which direction events will develop. He looked around and did not understand how quickly the hunters could become stronger. They reported to him that they were making sufficient progress because, having gone over to the side of the Nars, they had already been able to collect good supplies for themselves. The guy turned to his interlocutors and asked what concerns them directly. Therefore, they replied that this concerns them in the same way. The guy got a little indignant and started screaming because they should become stronger. After that, he pulled out his sword and swung it upward, shouting that they would definitely succeed. Therefore, his interlocutors also began to encourage the guy and say that they would also succeed. Each of them wanted to be part of something great. Therefore, each of them took out his weapon and they crossed it among themselves. Meanwhile, Hada called Li Jun to another training session, where he performed exactly the same ritual that the guy had previously done for John. He closed his eyes and couldn't even imagine that a stream of mana could emit such a pleasant warmth. Because when it creates a stream of mana, it feels as if a storm of mana is being created inside of him, tearing apart from within. Wada started to get nervous because things weren't going according to plan, so he immediately ordered Lee Jun to focus on his rhythm because they were almost there, and it was going to hurt. After this, a green ball began to form and a bright flash, which should have completely passed into Lee Jun's body. He sat with his eyes closed and really began to feel it. Vada continued to hold him and asked him to try not to make any sounds, no matter how difficult it was. A second later, his gaze changed greatly, and he was clearly shocked. He could not even imagine that everything would happen so horribly. The harmful energy is much stronger than he could have thought, because it not only absorbs the mana inside him, but also literally devours his body from the inside. Lee Jun endured it like a real man, and didn't make a single sound, even though it was really hard for him. Shvata understood that he should under no circumstances stop now, no matter how difficult it was for him. He understood that if he took on this and started, he must take full responsibility and finish everything he started. So he tried his best, working under the huge blue energy shield. Fenrir noticed all this and was quite surprised, since there was real madness going on, where a light stripe began to appear from the blue energy shield, which was heading towards the sky. Shaki also took notice of this as he began to sense a very dense source of energy in the icy lands, which surprised him greatly. He understood perfectly well that it couldn't be the leader or Vada, because both of them definitely didn't have enough strength. So the only one who could make such a volume of mana was Srin. He remembered a moment from that fight where Srin very easily passed through all his defenses and delivered an absolutely accurate blow to the head, which served as a warning. Shaki understood that he was experiencing quite unpleasant emotions then, but there was nowhere to go, so he began to shout and order all the Utgard warriors to prepare for battle. They looked at it as well as at the huge energy ball, after which they were very surprised. One of them approached the captain and said that the leader clearly would not approve of this. Shaki understood that they were not going to tolerate this anymore. Therefore, he began to shout and ask how much more time do they need to hide and shake from the enemy's attack, while waiting for the leader's orders? Where has the pride and honor of the Frost Giants gone? He was very confident in himself and his abilities, so he ordered to prepare for the fight, and also stated that all responsibility for further actions would rest only with him, because today they would definitely return the honor of the Ice Warriors. Everyone else knew that Shachi was saying really important things, so they bowed their heads and said that they were now completely under his command. After this, a very loud ringing occurred, which notified all residents that they were ready. The warriors began to gather and were ready to finally fight back and die for a good cause. Srin watched this flow of mana and felt the energy even here, despite the huge purple flash in the sky, but still could not understand who was doing this. Was it really Shachi? He understood perfectly well that even Shachi was not capable of this. But then he did not want to believe that all this was the work of his sworn enemy. Is it really the head of Utgard who is doing something like this right now? Srin understood perfectly well that now the leader should be busy with other things, so he did not understand what was happening, so he began to suspect that it was a trap. However, his eyes lit up, because he understood that there would definitely not be a better chance, and he must definitely take advantage of it. So he began to raise his hands and order his entire army to gather immediately, because today they would finally capture Utgard. The flash only intensified with every minute and had already completely pierced the sky. It was a terrible sight, which undoubtedly frightened and fascinated at the same time. Near this energy ball sat Fenrir, who was undoubtedly bored and waiting for his master. A huge army of people began to form near this ball, standing one opposite the other. The giants were tired of enduring and being afraid, so they were ready to fight for life and death. The warriors from Nars were also ready to show them their strength and become the new kings. Shachi came closer and decided to find out whose hands this matter was and what was happening. Srin understood that this was the work of Shachi, so he decided to ask him whether the leader was in this energy ball. Shachi was shocked by such a question, because he could not even think about the leader now. Srin understood that Shachi did not understand what was happening at all. However, Fenrir understood that he needed to somehow save the situation now, so he stood near this energy field and also prepared for battle. Seeing the enemy, he began to get angry because he understood that now his owner was really in danger. Joan understood perfectly well that Fenrir's reaction could only mean one thing: what was inside. This ball is located by Li Jun. Srin came closer to Shachi because now he did not understand what he was talking about. But after that he got angry and prepared for a fight, because now he definitely doesn't trust him and is definitely not ready to agree to a truce. He was very sorry that the leader was not here, but nevertheless, he was ready to put an end to the existence of the Utgard army today. Shachi took his axe and prepared to fight, because he understood perfectly well that now he had no other choice. He began to shout and order the giants to prepare to attack. Srin did exactly the same thing. After which, the Narses ran to attack their former allies. The giants understood that today was the day that would decide absolutely the entire fate of this region. Shachi rushed into battle and was ready to destroy Srin, even though he understood that his strength was not enough. Li Jun, meanwhile, was completing his transformation process. After which, his eyes opened, and his gaze was quite cold and self-confident. He stood up and immediately looked to the side. Vada looked at him and was glad that the guy had woken up. He was very tired. It seemed that the guy seemed to have grown old, but he continued to tell the guy that this was not all, because he had such powerful technique and energy. But he didn't have the strength, so before he could even finish his sentence, he fell to the ground unconscious. So Li quickly ran to his aid. He placed his hand on the doctor's neck to check his condition. Everything is fine. He is still alive, and there are good hopes that he will come to his senses. He just spent a lot of strength and energy, so we need to help him. Li Jun understood that Vada had just sacrificed his youth in order to save him, so he swore that he would not let him die. He understood that the Demon King used the elixir to save Grasp, but since he doesn't have it, the only way to do it is to use the Apple of Eden, called Edward's elixir, which Li Jun took from Odin, just in case. Li Jun understood that Vada ordered to absorb all the energy inside the technique, so he would definitely do it. So he looked at him and said that Vada should also absorb this Apple of Eden. Li Jun stood and began to activate his mana flow and destroy the energy barrier. He straightened his arms and was ready to absorb all this energy to save the doctor. And although it was really very difficult, it was necessary to endure, since there were simply no other options. Meanwhile, the giants fought with the Nars, who wanted to capture them. This was fundamentally important to defend one's honor. Joan understood that standing on the sidelines was not an option now, so she rushed into battle to help the army. She approached the huge giant from behind, who clearly was not expecting her, and then struck. Joan understood perfectly well that even though he was big, he still lacked strength. Suddenly, her gaze abruptly switched in the other direction. She managed to notice the impending attack in time and put a block. From such a collision, she was thrown back a little, and it was clearly visible that she was shocked. After this, the stick flew in the opposite direction towards its owner, and he took her tightly in his hands. The guy began to laugh and be happy that they met again, and he also praised her for still being strong. Joan looked at him and understood perfectly well that he was much stronger than the giants. So she started screaming and calling the princess for help. The princess immediately rushed into battle and was ready to give her life for the girl. She also looked towards where her opponent was. Then she turned around and stopped near the hostess, who stood opposite the enemy. He was shocked because he could not even imagine that there would be a monster near her. She ordered the princess to guard the area, because now she would be fighting this man, so her main task would be to make sure that no one interfered with them. The princess just smiled and said that she would do it without any problems. After that, she left the area and left the battle area clear. Joan smiled and said that in that case she was ready to begin. Her eyes lit up and she was completely ready to show everything that Li Jun had taught her. Mustache just laughed and said that now everything is starting to become much more interesting than it might seem at first glance. Srin continued his battle with Shachi, who clearly had no intention of giving up. Now, in this confrontation, one will clearly die, and the other will live. Srin was simply furious, so he used all his hatred also on ordinary opponents who came in his way. He smiled and praised Shachi for becoming much stronger. He decided not to exchange compliments, so he said that Srin remained at his previous level. After which another very strong explosion occurred. And then another one, which clearly could not pass without a trace. Shachi was injured and received enormous damage to his body, which greatly shocked and frightened him, because he understood perfectly well that if he died now, then most likely his army would lose. Since their last battle, Shachi has trained a lot, but the difference in strength is still very large, as expected from the strongest warrior of the giants. He started yelling at Srin and asking why he was still such a revered warrior when he betrayed his own people. Then Shachi jumped up and rushed into battle. He couldn't understand why Srin had betrayed them. Srin was ready to continue the battle and wanted to destroy Shachi so that he would not ask such unpleasant questions. The blast wave made Srin feel the full power and threw Shachi back. Srin began to scream and explain that he no longer had the strength and desire to listen and watch him play the king. Maybe Shachi doesn't know it yet, but he destroyed everything that was dear to them. From such words, Shachi was quite shocked and surprised, because he clearly did not know this, but still continued to fight without losing his vigilance. He made a sharp blow that hit his opponent's head. Srin was surprised and looked away. After all, his weapon fell to the ground and he wanted to quickly pick it up. Not having time to do this quickly, he hit Shachi with all his strength, who ran to take it away. Srin was very angry and wanted to deal with his former comrade, who refused to come over to his side. Srin did not give up trying to reason with Shachi, telling him that his best friend and Shachi's father, named Ovaldi, was killed by the leader. Shachi stopped and was simply shocked, because he had never known about this before. Srin ran up to him and started screaming, saying that it was the leader who killed Ovaldi. Shachi's face changed. He was completely depressed. Traces of the energy field also appeared near his body. The energy field was about to explode right now. What happened a second later? Srin was scared and surprised. Well, when he was there, absolutely everyone was shocked, including John and his opponent. The energy field was extremely strong and blinded absolutely everyone around. After the explosion, Li Jun was visible through the smoke, standing in the center of this ball. He was extremely upset because absolutely nothing helped. Li Jun looked at Vat, who was lying unconscious and had no more strength. Wada grew old and actually sacrificed himself to help Li Jun. The guy watched him and realized that his condition had now improved a little. It seemed that everything had gone exactly as he had planned, because the Apple of Eden is a treasure, many times more powerful than the elixir. But it looks like it barely saved his life, since Li Jun doesn't feel the flow of mana at all. But he didn't understand why this was happening. Maybe the whole point was that he absorbed the effect of the Apple of Eden while collecting mana? He squeezed his hand tightly and began to suspect that perhaps this is why he now feels such a huge flow of mana. Li Jun collected his thoughts and realized that it looked like right now he could easily defeat Hercules. But suddenly, he was surprised and frightened because he did not understand what these streams of mana were around him. He was shocked because there were tens of thousands of them, and he did not understand what was happening. At that moment, John ran up to him, wanting to help and make sure everything was fine. Joan smiled and asked if everything was okay with him. But suddenly the fallen angel began to express his contempt for Li Jun, which surprised him very much, because he did not understand why this could happen, but also all his indicators improved, including Hun Mu's level. The warriors were shocked that there was an ordinary person in the energy field, so they decided to immediately rush to the attack, because now this is a great chance and opportunity for them. But a second later, they were completely destroyed. Li Jun lit up like before every fight and understood that he needed Hyun Mu now. Now it was a completely different skull than a simple keychain on his hand, so he began to wait for further instructions from the guy with a smile. He approached Li Jun and asked him to trust him, asking if he wanted him to destroy these giants. But the guy just smiled and said that since Hyun Mu had changed quite a lot, he should take Vat to a safe place. Hyun Mu looked at him and said that he would fulfill his wish without any problem. Li Jun understood that Vata would now be safe, so now was the time to deal with his opponents. Therefore, without wasting a second, he also jumped into battle, since he himself understood that he had become happier. Li Jun looked like a real demon, which he partly was, and also wanted to destroy all opponents in his path. Sreen had already come closer to Shachi, who was in a state of shock, after which he swung his fist and wanted to destroy him. But Li Jun managed to come to his aid in time and strike back, which definitely shocked Sri. This caused his opponent to fly several meters to the side, but it is still worth recognizing that striking after you have told your opponent the story of who destroyed his father is a rather wrong decision, because you could have negotiated and lured him away to your side. Shachi watched Li Jun help and was shocked that the guy was able to throw him so far. Li Jun had become much stronger compared to their last meeting. His eyes were burning. He was ready to destroy his opponent right here and now. The princess, meanwhile, also destroyed opponents on her way. Li Jun looked towards Fenrir and said that he could do as he wished. After this, Fenrir caught fire and was ready to rush into battle, because he was truly overwhelmed with hatred. So he quickly turned into a wolf and was ready to fight a little. Then he quickly jumped and left Li Jun, who was still standing still for a while and thinking about what to do. He looked towards the hunters and invited them to start talking. There were 3 of them and they were all ready to fight. Their commander asked Li Jun who he really was and what he needed. The guy understood perfectly well that they definitely should not be underestimated, because they are all heroes, and the 2 behind are not inferior in strength to John. Li Jun decided to act cautiously, so he said that he would like to ask them something and find out who they are. The commander's name is Yubi. Li Jun was surprised because he didn't know anyone with that name. But he also understood that someone with similar abilities must have been in the Demon King's records. So Li Jun took out his weapon and said that he would ask him one more thing. He looked at him with hatred in his eyes and asked why he decided to betray people. Was it really because they were not hunters? Yubi began to get angry and panic, because he did not betray them and tried to convince his interlocutor of this. Then he jumped, and he immediately rushed into battle, because this was their fate, and all this is done primarily for the highest good. Li Jun immediately entered into battle with him, because he did not believe a single word he said. Yubi was amazed by the guy's strength, so he retreated a little after missing the blow. John started shouting at him and asking how great is it to betray people. Yubi shouted back that he and Sreen had an agreement, and if the king of Utgard was defeated, he would help them restore China. Li Jun continued to attack him and shout, because he could have made the exact same agreement with the king of Utgard. Yubi stood with a weapon and waited in horror for the approach of his opponent. When Li Jun approached him, Yubi was able to dodge and stand behind him, so Jun immediately called Hyun Mu and ordered him to give him the equipment. They continued their battle because Jun wanted to destroy his opponent, and Yubi would be nice to try to survive. Li Jun then made a very strong strike with his fire sword, which caused Yubi to fall to the ground. When the equipment arrived, all Li Jun had to do was pick it up. But at that moment, a second hunter appeared, rushed into battle and said that Li Jun was now trapped. The guy really didn't expect this, so he was shocked. But he had to make a decision immediately. Yet he gripped his spear very tightly. After which, Li Jun began to float in the air and tried to choose the most effective angle of attack for himself. He turned in the air and hit his opponent with enormous force, which he clearly did not expect. Li Jun understood that it was better for them not to get in his way, so he threw them very far away with a shockwave. Yubi decided to continue the dialogue with the guy, saying that he would never side with the king of Utgard. After all, he has killed countless people simply because of some kind of infection, so it is completely pointless to work together with such a person. Li Jun thought about it. Is he really talking about the incident that only hunters know about? The one that happened after the death of Ivat? Now this does explain why there were so few survivors in Utgard and why the hunters betrayed him. But he was still angry. Li Jun said that he needed it to restore China, but he betrayed them. Yubi started screaming and saying that he had absolutely not betrayed anyone. Now they, with their entire team, prepared to attack the guy in order to close his mouth and destroy him. Li Jun understood that now he did not know the whole situation. So first he would need to defeat them. And only then he could talk to them, so he suggested with a smile that they should attack. Shaki also continued to dialogue with his opponent, who told him that Ovaldi noticed that the leader was planning something. The leader wanted to turn this land into Jotunheim. Shaki was surprised because he didn't understand what he meant now. Loki wanted to completely cleanse these lands and make them the lands of giants, so he planned to destroy all creatures except giants. And Ovaldi tried to stop him. Shaki was filled with hatred, but he could not understand why this had to be done. And he also did not understand why Srin was telling him about this only now. He swung his hand and rushed to fight him again. Srin understood that the enemy was serious, so he was a little shocked, because it seemed like he didn't really want to fight right now. Shachi hit him with great force. But Srin managed to block his blow, but Shachi still could not leave the thought of only one thing. He couldn't understand why Srin was telling him about this only now. Why didn't he say this before? Srin understood perfectly well that now he could not afford to lose another friend, because he was too loyal a warrior of the giants. So he was not sure whether Shachi could betray the leader, knowing that he killed his father. He quickly released the hold and threw Shachi away, and also explained to him that even with all this information received, his body still spoke for itself. After this, Srin rushed to the attack, and he hit Shaki with all his might, who was still in a state of shock. But is this what real friends do? Shachi received a huge amount of damage and began screaming in mental and physical pain. Srin made a knockout blow and placed Shachi on his hand. He decided it would be best if he slept until this was all over. Then he heard a loud scream that made him stop. Srin looked behind him, but could not see anyone yet. All that caught his eye were the bodies of already dead warriors, which continued to lie on the ground. It was Li Jun who was smiling and looking at Sri. His opponent immediately caught fire because he understood that now it would be really very interesting. Srin just looked at him and also understood perfectly well that now he was a special person. He knew that Li Jun would be much more dangerous than Shachi, so he should not be underestimated. Although, After thinking a little, he understood that the guy was just as dangerous as Loki. After these thoughts, he became very angry. But there was no other choice, so he tuned in and was ready to fight, since he needed to end this once and for all. He activated his superpowers of confidence, which he saved at the time of the battle with the king. But now nothing can be done. Li Jun showed him his hand. And then he calmed down and waved his hands again, saying that he did not intend to fight. And now he was ready to give up. Srin was shocked by this answer. Joan also didn't know how to react to such a situation and was very worried. All the other warriors who fought for Shachi were at a loss. Yubi sat on the ground and received a dose of medicine. Li Jun gave them to him to heal his wounds. But Yubi didn't understand why he should do this. Li Jun just looked away and said that he had no more reason to fight. The Utgard commander is currently unconscious. And also, he now understood the main reason why people chose the side of the Nars. So now he is also a simple mercenary who is leaving this battle. Srin was at a loss, as he expected that this would be a very difficult fight. But still he smiled and said that it was just wonderful. The Nairs began to rejoice because they had just won. And the warriors who fought for the giants were at a loss. Srin ordered not to kill them, because in this war there was already enough bloodshed of frost giants. Li Jun looked at them and said that he would be happy to watch their exploits. So don't let them down. Yubi was also surprised by such actions on the part of the guy. Therefore, the rest of the team wanted to meet him and chat. Srin said that from now on, they will advance towards Ungard and destroy the king, Loki. All the other warriors continued to rejoice and rejoice, because this is what they have been achieving for so long. But Li Jun continued to feel a little sad, because the fallen angel was unhappy. So he began to suspect that maybe it was because he heard the name of King Utgard. Shri approached him and decided to talk to the guy, because he was really interested in why he retreated. So Li Jun explained to him that, first of all, he was still just a mercenary. He then looked at Srin and smiled and said that if he paid him well, then perhaps he would take their side. Srin smiled and said that they could agree without any problems. The Nair's army then continued its march to Utgard, while Li Jun remained with his family for now. Joan started asking if he was okay, but the guy just smiled and asked if there were any problems. He started putting on his t-shirt and asked if he hadn't told her from the very beginning that for the most part, they weren't on anyone's side. They have already achieved the goals they set before entering China. And hunters like Yubi and his team will be able to help the remaining people in Utgard without any problems. This is the best outcome of events. Joan smiled, because she really began to understand what he was talking about. The Nars offensive was truly successful, and they were able to enter the castle very quickly. Since most of the people lost the battle with the giant warriors, and also because the Nars retained most of their forces, they were able to easily penetrate into the city. Li Jun looked at Vat, who was already able to open his eyes, and asked if everything was okay with him. He was very happy that he woke up, but Fata seemed scared. He turned his head to the side and did not want to talk. Fata saw the ruins that occurred in Utgard, and also that the castle is now ruled by the Nars. This made him extremely angry. He started yelling at Li Jun and asking if he was really a traitor from the very beginning. Li Jun was shocked by this question because he didn't understand why Hwara was saying that. He smiled and said that although it was a little late, the rescue team had indeed arrived. Fata quickly calmed down and decided to ask what he meant. Li Jun showed him the hunters with whom they had already become friends. He ordered Yubi to gather all the people from Utgard, and if they saw the passage, then let them immediately leave this fortress. Li Jun smiled and looked at Vat, because now he decided to ask him to help them a little, because if he is with them, he will be able to gather people without any problems, since they trust him. Shvada understood perfectly well that he was in vain to get excited, since Li Jun really wants to save people. and although he did not fully understand what was happening, he was still ready to help. Li Jun thanked him and said that for now he will return to his mercenary duties. Fada stopped him and wanted to ask him something before the guy left. Namely, he was interested in knowing Li Jun's well-being. The guy clenched his hand into a fist with all his might. And then he smiled because he was starting to feel really amazing. But now he had a new mission in which he had to get rid of the imposter in 15 minutes. The part of the castle where the fighting took place was on fire, so people left its territory through special paths. Yubi led them out and showed them the way. Hwada was very worried about Li Jun and wanted him to be very careful because the king is extremely strong. Loki, meanwhile, continued to sit on his throne and prepare. Srin and his team of warriors came into his room, who were absolutely not ready to talk peacefully. Loki looked at them and asked how they dared to come to the castle, and also wanted to find out from them the name of the traitor. Srin was ready to fight and said that now it was his turn to become the new king. Loki looked at him and understood perfectly well that it would have been better to destroy Srin when he had this opportunity. But he ignored it. Li Jun and the girl came here to also watch what was happening and were very surprised that Loki was really very calm, even despite the fact that there were hundreds of giants standing next to him. So they began to suspect that he had some kind of trump card in his sleeve, which he will be ready to use very soon. Srin smiled and asked if Loki really regretted that he could not kill him, just like Ovaldi. Loki also laughed at this joke. He knew full well that Ovaldi was the reason for his defection. Srin started shouting and insulting him because he was really his good friend. So he immediately caught fire and was ready to fight. Loki even praised his interlocutor for his good physical shape. And I gave him a like, which you can also put under this video now. And also subscribe to the channel. Besides, if you write a positive comment, I will be very pleased. Everyone constantly wondered why Loki had a coffin in the room, because no one could ever understand it. How suddenly a hand began to come out of it, and a huge monster appeared, which was clearly not ready to talk now. He broke the window and immediately jumped out of it. He then landed on the ground and was furious. After which, a huge number of giants without self-awareness appeared, who now guarded Loki. Li Jun realized that they were very similar to those he met for the first time in the forest. Loki continued to laugh, because now the numerical advantage was on his side. Srin started yelling at him because he couldn't understand what Loki had just done. Li Jun heard that most of the giants died due to an infectious disease. But isn't that true? After all, these giants really are simply on a different level than those he saw in the world of ice. They are extremely strong, and also they have no consciousness, and when they go on a rampage with the desire to destroy, they will become very obedient to the king. So now everything has become obvious. The king sacrificed his people in order to create an army. Loki laughed, because he needed an army that would obey only him, which he managed to do. Srin could not listen to this, so he immediately rushed into battle. He was furious, so he wanted to destroy his opponent right now. Loki continued to laugh, because he understood that he was much stronger and wanted to prolong the pleasure a little. Then he swung and was ready to meet his opponent. Srin was shocked as he received a blow of enormous force, which had the same effect as an electric shock. Loki's power was indeed very strong. It was something similar to Li Jun's energy field, only much stronger, which threw Srin far beyond the palace grounds. Loki did not hesitate to break everything around him, and also called on his loyal soldiers to help. He ordered them to completely destroy their enemy. The giants prepared for battle without any problems, and wanted to destroy the enemy as soon as possible. There were just a lot of them, so we had to somehow deal with them. The Nair's warriors were shocked by this development of events, because Loki was able to disable his opponent with just one precise blow, so they did not even know what to do now. Suddenly, a hand appeared and began to make its way into the room. It was Srin, who was extremely angry and was preparing to destroy his archenemy. He started shouting and ordered the Nares to immediately deal with the leader, who had lost his pride. They were very happy to see him, so they prepared to attack and help him without any problems. Lee Jun was getting ready to fight, but John wanted to at least get an explanation from him about what was happening right now. So he told her that Loki needed a personal army. And it looks like he reassembled the giants for this purpose. But the girl couldn't believe it, because did he really destroy his own people and conduct experiments on them? Lee Jun said that this is a maddened king who only sees his people as tools. So he is a real monster. The giants were truly terrible, because they had absolutely no consciousness, as well as empathy. Their gaze was empty. All they wanted was to destroy their opponents. Therefore, one of them ran up to the giant from the Nares army and bit him severely. And he tore off a piece of his clothing. The thing is that the reassembled giants have no consciousness, which is why they attack like crazy berserkers. If this continues, the Nares will not be able to win, so there is only one option left. Lee Jun looked in their direction and understood that he really had no other choice. Loki continued to laugh at his opponents, who had no idea who they were going to fight with. Lee Jun, meanwhile, fully charged his Muspelheim spear with mana and prepared to fight. Now his main task was to defeat the king, after which he jumped and prepared to implement this idea. Compared to other giants, he seemed very small, but he would indeed cause a lot of problems. Lee Jun swung his hand and prepared to hit Loki with all his might. He just looked in the direction of this little man and became extremely serious. Although at first glance, Lee Jun could bring him about as many threats as one ant could for a person. Still, the force of his blow was quite crushing, which Loki immediately felt on himself. The smile on his face practically disappeared. He only told Lee Jun that he had been watching him for a long time. Therefore, he prepared to strike back at him, saying that he felt that his mana was much stronger than that of everyone present. He swung his fist and hit it with all his might, since he didn't need unnecessary problems from people. Lee Jun saw the shockwave coming at him, so he prepared to block it and strike back. But still, after that, he began to panic because he simply did not have time to dodge her. Lee Jun turned his gaze to the side and became even more wary. But it seemed like this was a necessary opportunity. Fortunately, he managed to avoid such a blow. And the blast wave simply headed towards the wall of the room. Loki was shocked by what was happening, because for the first time he met a creature on his way that was capable of reflecting his releasing blow. Shaki came into the room, who helped Lee Jun escape from the blow and clearly wanted revenge. He was full of hatred, and tears appeared in his eyes. Shaki understood that now he needed to take an important step. Lee Jun noticed him and started shouting in his direction. But his comrade smiled and said that now he leaves the showdown with the giants to Lee Jun. He is ready to take the baton and take revenge. But a second later he fell exhausted to the ground, something that had never happened to him before. Srin was shocked, so he turned and started shouting toward Shachi, trying to bring him to his senses. Loki laughed, because he understood that he was a real weakling, who could not even be asked for a favor, so he promised Shachi that as soon as the fight was over, he would turn the first one into his soldier. Lee Jun started screaming and ordered Fenrir to act carefully. Fenrir hated Loki with all his heart, so he did not miss the opportunity to fight him and take revenge. He began to rush around in a circle, causing Loki a lot of damage, which he clearly did not expect. But still he laughed, because he understood that Fenrir had become much weaker than before. He then fell into a state of insanity and prepared to release a massive burst of mana to harm everyone in the room. Fenrir was the first to take the blow and was defeated, but there were only 5 minutes left before the end of the mission. Fallen Angel ordered Lee Jun to immediately erase Loki from the face of the earth, so he asked John to try to delay him for at least 1 minute. Joan began to get very nervous, because she didn't understand how this could be done with someone who defeated Fenrir with just one blow. Srin rushed into battle and wanted to destroy his opponent. Loki just looked in his direction and was ready to accept this fight. Therefore, right now there is a clash between two forces that were previously ready to give their lives for each other. Lee Jun said that Srin alone is not enough, so he really needs her now. From such words, she realized that she was truly valuable to the guy and was ready to detain her opponent for at least an hour. John jumped and immediately rushed into battle. Lee Jun didn't waste any time, so he activated his spear and started charging it with mana again. It had already reached the limit of mana release, but Lee Jun understood that this was still not enough, and more was needed. Loki continued to destroy everyone in his path and swung his fist to finish off Srin. Joan quickly ran to his aid so as not to fight these monsters alone. But Loki didn't even take her seriously, but only put up a simple defense against this blow. Joan realized that a retaliatory blow was now flying in her direction, so she immediately put her sword down to block it. There was a violent clash between them, which was quite likely to be expected. Lee Jun was happy because his spear had now increased its level due to the high temperature. But it was still not enough. He understood that he needed a little more mana for everything to be successful, because it was extremely important for him to finish off the enemy with just one blow. Now the spear has become so hot that it can no longer withstand the temperature and begins to collapse. Lee Jun was furious and immediately rushed into battle, as he was well aware that right now he only had one chance. He ran up and threw the spear at his opponent with great force, after which there was an explosion of enormous force, which would be difficult to even compare with anything. The spear did its job and hit the target. Loki was shocked, and the smile completely disappeared from his face. The mission was accomplished as his body was pierced through. Shvata watched this spectacle with other people and could not even believe that all this was really happening. And for the first time the sun appeared, which had not existed since the time of problems in China, where under the incredible light of the sun, Utgard Loki died. The king himself and his castle were completely burned to the ground. The giants who were under the influence of the king were also destroyed by the Nars. One might even call it liberation rather than death. After all this, 4 leaders gathered at the ashes of the castle, the first of whom was Shachi, Sryth, who finally defeated his enemy, Yubi, who trusted his captain, and also Lee Jun, who was one of the main reasons for the victory. But this fight is still not over. Sryth looked at Yubi and said that he would definitely keep his promise. Yubi was happy because he really trusted the right person. After this, Sryth wanted to talk to Shachi. He ordered Shachi to kill him immediately. After all, whatever the reason, Sryth considered himself a traitor, and the blood of his own people was on him. And although his revenge has been accomplished, he still hopes that he will spare the Nasrs who followed him. Shachi looked at his former partner and thought about the right thing to do. He took the axe in his hands, and he said that he would fulfill his wish without any problems, and Sryth stood on his knees and waited for his punishment. When it was all over, Shachi looked into the distance, along with Lee Jun, and thought about the future. Lee Jun decided to ask Shachi, "Doesn't he hate him?" Shachi turned his head towards the guy, and with a smile he said that he didn't even have such thoughts, because he was very grateful to him for being able to make the right decision. He looked at the guy and said that he was like one of their warriors, and he was not against it. Now there is finally peace in the castle. Everyone helped restore it as best they could. The hunters commanded the people and told them what to do. Yubi stood with Lee and thanked him that everything was fine now. Lee Jun looked at Yubi and asked what exactly did he need help with. He looked at the guy and said that they had already done everything in their power, but ordinary people would not be able to last long on these unsuitable lands. He also said that they were thinking about going beyond the wall, so they asked him for help to do it. Li Jun immediately agreed, although he understood that this was not a very good decision, since indeed a lot would change soon. Yubi was simply shocked by this, because he didn't understand what he was talking about now. Li Jun decided to repeat to him that he really didn't think that going beyond the wall would be a good decision. So he needed to stay here since the whole world would soon become a gate. Yubi understood everything, but did not know what to do with food and cold. Therefore, Li Jun gave him a monster called Purimora, which can be used as a food source and also grows very quickly in any environment. He also said that Yubi can fertilize him with monster bones, so he doesn't have to worry about hunger at all. Yubi asked how he knew all this, but Li Jun just smiled and said that he could also help with the cold. He thanked him for his help and said that next time they would definitely not be in debt. Meanwhile, Li Jun went to the tent for another meeting. Srin was happy when he saw the guy and asked how the new leader of the giants was coping. Li Jun said that it would be much better if he asked him about this directly, without intermediaries. But Srin was still worried about the fact that the guy clearly did not want to see the enemy on his territory. The guy smiled because maybe they are enemies, but at the same time they are not? What is the problem? Srin understood that one who shed the blood of his people cannot become a leader, so he rejected this proposal from Shachi and decided to lead the Nars, and also for the ice giants, who are very aggressive in battle. They can only grow when they have an enemy. Srin also said that when monsters are just like prey for them, then the only ones who can be enemies. It's just them. Real people. Li Jun was shocked by what he just heard. Therefore, he immediately warned Srin that if they give people too much attention, there may be quite serious losses in the future if they become enemies. But Srin agreed with this and said that he respects people very much. Li Jun said that the only reason he is here is to learn from Srin. He smiled and said that if Loft Loki wanted it, he would have no problem giving it to him, because Li Jun was the one who saved the giants. The guy was at a loss, because he didn't know who Loft Loki was. But Srin calmed him down and said that in the ancient language of the giants, this means the one who destroyed Loki. The fallen angel, meanwhile, pursed his lips, which surprised Li Jun, because every time this name is mentioned, there is always a reaction, but nevertheless, he said that he would like to learn the release technique from Srin. Srin said that he was ready to satisfy this request without any problems, but he was not entirely sure whether this was possible. The thing is that release is a technique that allows you to maximize the dormant abilities and the power of mana that is in the body, but this requires a colossal amount of mana. Therefore, without the physiology of giants who have enough mana to sustain the body, others are unable to learn this technique. A second later, a huge fiery flame formed. Srin was very surprised by this. Shachi didn't understand what this huge amount of mana was. Could it really be Li Jun again? Joan was daydreaming and really understood that she was meeting a real genius. Li Jun was fired up and was completely ready to learn this technique. He smiled and absolutely believed that he had much more mana than Srin. His interlocutor smiled and said that this was exactly the attitude he needed. When it was all over, Li Jun walked out to the top of the mountain and looked towards the castle. He was very angry with Utgard Loki, who did all this. It really was a real monster who used his own people in experiments to create an army. It's also the famous trash that used the knowledge of Chinese hunters to turn release-wielding giants into mindless killing machines. But how did he force the giants to listen to his orders and also gained complete control over them? Come to think of it, Loki was an amazing warrior, but he wasn't the type to do something like that on his own, so someone helped him. Could these be intruders who came to the giant's fortress? After all, people say that they didn't do anything and just left. So Li Jun thought that any outsider could be the Demon King. But if it's not him, then. Could this be the Black Hood? After these thoughts, someone called Lee Jun, and he looked up from his thoughts. Joan said that people are holding a festival to which they were also invited. Lee Jun thought about it and seemed a little scared. He took the girl by the hand and wanted to tell her not to go there under any circumstances. Just kidding. It was John who took his hand and led him along. Because everyone was already waiting for them there, people enjoyed life and prepared a place for a celebration. This is how people should live, and even if things may not go well, isn't life itself difficult? We just need to be grateful that we just survived and got another regular day. Joan and his boyfriend rejoiced at this wonderful sight, because the festival is really taking place next to the gate, which gives hope for a bright future. After these words, Lee Jun asked the girl to complete this festival as soon as possible, which surprised her very much. The guy turned around and walked in the other direction. He walked onto the podium, where hundreds of people watched him, who began to call him Loki and glorify him. They were happy and understood that Loki now wanted to say something. Lee Jun only increased the flow of mana in his body, and he increased the amount of magical power, after which he was completely ready. He was like a real monster who decided to ruin everyone's holiday, because he looked pretty terrible right now. Yubi, along with the other hunters, were shocked and scared. On the contrary, John continued to admire him because he really was very handsome and chose her. In the tent, Serene also watched what was happening, and I was really glad that Loki was truly a unique person. People couldn't believe it because the sun began to appear for the first time. Lee Jun made the sun appear in the sky. He was happy because he understood that all this was really his great merit, and he was happy to give happiness to people. However, after the celebration, he still went to the top of the castle to talk with Yubi. He started asking him if Lee Jun was really going to leave. He has nothing else to do here, so he introduced heat into all the supports outside the settlement. And also using the magical power of implantation that he learned from watching Park Jae-hyun, he will also use the protective magic from Merlin's necklace, thereby stopping the flames from growing. So as long as the supports do not break, the flames will be stable. Yubi was very happy about this, but still decided to ask the guy if he really needed to leave now. After all, he was counting on being able to repay his debt. But Lee Jun just smiled and said that they would definitely see each other again. After that, he ran to his team, who had been waiting for him for so long. Joan was happy about his arrival, and wanted to spend time alone with him as quickly as possible. Lee Jun was a little surprised by this, so he asked if the girl was really not joking now. But she spoke absolutely seriously and just smiled, saying that she would be pleased if he showed her a few of his techniques. Lee Jun was even a little embarrassed by this. But still, he said that they now need to leave, and also said that he had already made sure that the people could maintain the heat themselves, even after they left. Fenrir stood opposite his master and also waited for further instructions. After which, blue magic with flashes happened again, and the little guy turned into a huge blue wolf. Lee Jun turned to Yubi and said that now it was time for them to move on, but he hoped that when they returned, Yubi would be much stronger. He just smiled and really hoped that they would definitely meet again. The road was again quite long and difficult, so at night the guys began to sit by the fire and warm up. John recalled this whole journey with a smile because it was indeed very stressful, but it was fun. Lee Jun looked at the sky and understood that having gone through such a difficult path as this, he would not want to repeat it again. The princess also got out and started joking, so the girl decided to find out if she liked this trip, although the answer is already quite obvious. Lee Jun looked at her and asked how her internal cultivation training was going. He had told her before that internal cultivation was definitely not the easiest to learn. Even if it is not much, John believes that she was able to find a clue for internal cultivation and mana flow. But Lee Jun said that, then she needs to hurry up. After all, there wasn't much time left and it scared him. Even now, the dragon's heart, which is located not far from his own, continues to charge. And even though he does not want it, it continues to saturate his magical power, increasing his development and the strength of everyone around him. Therefore, this is a sign that things will change soon, because everyone is becoming stronger, even the monsters. The whole world is changing, which means that saturating China with mana was just the beginning. Joan was scared, so she wanted to urgently talk to the guy. He saw the fear in her eyes, so he quickly decided to find out what was the reason for it. She just pointed her finger and said that the whole problem was this. Joan looked in that direction and was also very shocked. Because right now, Mount Paektusan suddenly began to burn.